Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. It was an ordinary evening. I had just settled down on my couch, ready to relax after a long day. You know that kind of calm where everything seems to finally slow down? Well, that peace was shattered when I caught a glimpse of something chilling. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, there was a man, his face barely visible, peeking from the bedroom door. My heart froze, and in that eerie moment, time felt like it stopped. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, he bolted, disappearing as quickly as he'd appeared. Panic set in instantly, and I felt my body lock up. Fear wrapped its cold hands around me, and all I could think about was getting out. But there was a problem. My phone and keys were on the table. For some reason, it felt like reaching for them would take a lifetime, and my legs refused to move. That haunting feeling of being trapped was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I finally mustered the strength to dash towards the door, but every step felt like I was moving through quicksand. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if he comes back? What if he's hiding? The apartment suddenly felt like a maze, each corner hiding a new terror. I made it to the front door, but I still didn't have my phone or keys. The fear of not being able to call for help weighed on me, pressing down harder with each passing second. As I stood there, torn between fleeing without my things or staying to search, the silence of the apartment became almost deafening. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself imagining the man behind every door and shadow. The eerie quiet was suffocating, and I knew I couldn't stay much longer. But something in me was paralyzed, too afraid to move, yet terrified to stay still. My mind played out every possible worst-case scenario. The thought of him still being in the apartment was overwhelming, but the fear of stepping outside without any means of contacting anyone was just as frightening. In that moment, I realized how vulnerable I was, completely unprepared for this chilling encounter. It felt like I was walking a tightrope between two equally terrifying choices. The minutes dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. I kept glancing at the bedroom door, half expecting him to appear again. My heart raced faster and my pulse echoed in my ears. Then, almost as if something snapped inside me, I grabbed the doorknob and swung the door open. The cool air of the hallway hit my face, and for a second I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But it didn't last. The hallway was eerily empty, and that sense of safety was short-lived. The fear returned in waves, stronger than before, as I realized I had left the door wide open. What if he was still inside, waiting for me to come back? I didn't want to take any more chances. I ran to the neighbor's apartment and pounded on the door like my life depended on it. Every second I stood outside, the thought of that man lurking inside my apartment gnawed at me. My neighbor answered, and I stumbled inside, breathless and shaking. It was only then that I realized how close I had come to complete panic. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no clues left behind. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But the haunting feeling of his presence lingered, as if he had left a piece of that fear behind. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might return. Every creak in the apartment, every shadow cast by the dim light felt like a warning. The fear didn't just vanish when the police left. It stayed, like a chilling reminder that safety can disappear in an instant. And the worst part was knowing he was still out there somewhere, watching. I changed the locks, got an alarm system, and even started carrying my phone everywhere. But the memory of that night stayed with me, vivid and unsettling. It wasn't just the idea of an intruder that haunted me. It was the terrifying realization of how powerless I had felt in my own home. That eerie night still plays over in my mind sometimes, a chilling reminder of how fragile the feeling of safety can be. What made the experience even more haunting was not knowing why he was there or what he wanted. Was it a random break-in? Or had he been watching me for days, waiting for the right moment? That question lingers, unanswered, like an unsolved mystery that continues to send shivers down my spine. It was the kind of night that felt like everything was finally still, the silence settling over the house like a heavy blanket. I had just crawled into bed, sinking into the comfort of my pillows, when I heard it, a soft but unmistakable noise near the back door. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind or some animal, but something about the sound felt wrong. You know that chilling sensation when your instincts tell you something's off? That's exactly what I felt. I lay there, frozen, straining my ears to catch any more sounds. And then it came again, a distinct jiggling, like someone testing the door handle. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, and suddenly I was wide awake. The eerie quiet of the house only made the noise seem louder, more deliberate. Fear washed over me as I realized someone was trying to get inside. Without thinking, I bolted upright and ran for my bedroom. Every step I took seemed louder than the last, like I was giving myself away. The moment I reached my room, I shut the door behind me, holding my breath, waiting. I could hear the intruder outside now, more clearly, trying to force the door open. The thought of someone lurking just outside in the dark sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the police, whispering the situation as quietly as I could. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, listening to the eerie sounds from outside. I thought about confronting the person, but fear held me in place. I kept imagining the worst. What if they broke in before help arrived? The thought of being face to face with a stranger in the dead of night was haunting. All I could do was wait, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then I heard it, a distant siren, growing louder. Relief started to wash over me, but it was short-lived. The intruder must have heard it too, because suddenly the noise stopped. I rushed to the window, heart racing, and saw a shadow moving quickly away from the house. The eerie glow of the streetlight illuminated the figure for just a moment before they disappeared into the darkness. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no clues left behind. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they would patrol the neighborhood, but the haunting feeling of knowing someone had been so close, trying to get inside, didn't go away. That night, the fear lingered long after the police were gone, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. For weeks after, every little noise set my nerves on edge. The soft creak of the house settling, the rustle of wind outside, it all felt like a prelude to something more sinister. The eerie silence I once found comforting became a reminder of how vulnerable I had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder might come back, that they were still out there, waiting for another chance. Eventually, I installed extra locks, security cameras, anything to make myself feel safer. But no matter how many precautions I took, the memory of that night stayed with me. It wasn't just the fear of what had almost happened. It was the chilling realization that someone had been out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. That sense of violation, of being hunted, never really leaves you. In the end, the police never caught the person. It became one of those unsolved mysteries that gnaws at the back of your mind, leaving you with more questions than answers. Why were they there? What were they planning? Every now and then, I wonder if they ever tried again at someone else's house, or if they were just a shadow passing through my life for one eerie night. The experience changed me in ways I didn't expect. I used to think of my home as a safe haven, but after that night, it felt different, like the walls couldn't protect me from the world outside. It's haunting to realize how quickly that feeling of security can be shattered, how a single night can leave a mark that never quite fades. It was a typical morning when I first found the note. There was nothing particularly special about the day, just me getting ready for work, the usual routine. As I opened the front door to leave, a small slip of paper fluttered down from the doorframe. I bent down to pick it up, not thinking much of it at first. But when I unfolded it, the words sent a chill down my spine. "Be careful. We're watching." My stomach dropped. Who was we? And why were they watching? At first, I thought maybe it was a prank, some cruel joke by a neighborhood kid or a disgruntled neighbor. But something about the message felt too personal, too eerie to just brush off. The handwriting was jagged, almost hurried, as if the writer had been in a rush to deliver it. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was quiet, eerily quiet. As the day wore on, the note nagged at the back of my mind. I couldn't focus at work. My thoughts kept drifting back to it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but a sense of unease clung to me like a heavy fog. When I got home that evening, my heart sank as I noticed something even more unsettling. There were light scratches on the back door, like someone had tried to tamper with it. Suddenly, that note felt a lot more real and a lot more dangerous. That night, as I lay in bed, every sound seemed amplified. The usual creaks and groans of the house now felt like something more sinister. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the fear, when I heard it. A soft knock. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time, and from different parts of the house. Someone was knocking on my windows, on the doors, slowly making their way around the house. The fear that washed over me was chilling. I stayed frozen in bed, too terrified to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare get up to investigate. The eerie thought of coming face to face with whoever was out there kept me rooted in place. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more haunting, leaving me in a state of suspense that gnawed at my nerves. The next morning, I found no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone trying to scare me, or was there something darker at play? The note and the knocks felt like pieces of a puzzle, but I couldn't figure out what the picture was supposed to be. All I knew was that I wasn't alone, and that thought sent a shiver down my spine. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me, as if someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting. The knocks came again, always at night, always when I was alone. They would move from one window to the next, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder was taunting me. The fear was becoming suffocating, each eerie noise pushing me closer to the edge. I tried to report it to the police, but with no real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested it might be a prank or just my imagination, but I knew better. The haunting presence was real, and it wasn't going away. Every night I braced myself for the inevitable knocks, my mind racing with dread, wondering what would happen if they ever tried to get inside. One night, after the usual knocks had come and gone, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I stayed awake, crouched by the window, waiting for whoever was out there to return. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I saw a shadow, a figure standing by the back door, barely visible in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. They were there, watching, just like the note had warned. I couldn't see their face, but the figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the house. Then, slowly, they reached up and placed another note on the door before slipping away into the night. I waited until I was sure they were gone before opening the door and grabbing the note. My hands shook as I unfolded it, my heart pounding in my ears. This time, the message was even more chilling. You didn't listen. Now we're coming. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The eerie weight of the threat hung over me, pressing down with an intensity that was almost suffocating. I kept every light in the house on, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The sense of dread was overwhelming, the haunting reality that whoever had been leaving the notes wasn't done yet. They were coming back, and this time, I didn't think they'd stop at knocking. It started off as just another normal evening. I had finished dinner and was about to settle into a quiet night of watching TV when I heard a soft knock on the window. At first, I brushed it off as maybe a tree branch or something innocent, but there was something eerie about the sound, persistent, almost deliberate. I glanced outside but didn't see anyone. I told myself it was nothing and went back to the couch, but that gnawing feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. A little later, I noticed it. Parked just outside, not directly in front of my house, but close enough to be suspicious. It was a car I didn't recognize. Now I live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows each other, so an unfamiliar car sticks out like a sore thumb. The headlights were off, and there was no movement inside, but something about its presence gave me chills. It was as if the car itself was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, observing the house. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a neighbor's guest, or was it something more sinister? The longer I looked at it, the more I realized how out of place it was. It hadn't been there earlier, and now it sat there like a dark silhouette in the night. The sense of being watched was almost suffocating, sending a chill down my spine. Trying not to panic, I thought about calling someone, but I hesitated. Who do you even call for something like this? It wasn't exactly an emergency, yet the eerie feeling of being stalked crept through my bones. I decided to play it safe and called the non-emergency police line, just to report the suspicious vehicle. The operator assured me they would send someone to check it out, but even after hanging up, the tension lingered. As I waited for the police, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the car to suddenly speed away or for someone to step out. But nothing happened. The car just sat there, unmoving, like a predator lying in wait. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. It was chilling how still everything was, how the night seemed to press in closer, amplifying every small sound inside the house. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The moment the police car turned the corner, the unknown vehicle's engine roared to life. My heart skipped a beat as the car peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement. Whoever had been inside clearly didn't want to stick around for questions. It was haunting how quickly they reacted, almost as if they'd been waiting for the exact moment to make their escape. The police pursued them, and I watched from the window, my breath caught in my throat. The eerie silence of the night had been shattered, replaced by the sound of sirens and screeching tires disappearing into the distance. I was left standing in the dim light of my living room. The unsettling image of the car still burned into my mind. The sense of violation was chilling. Someone had been watching me, lurking just outside, and I had no idea why. Later that night, the police returned to let me know they had caught the driver. My relief quickly turned to dread when they told me the driver had no reasonable explanation for being there. They weren't from the neighborhood, didn't know anyone in the area, and had no reason to park outside my house. The officer mentioned the driver had a history of suspicious behavior, but without any evidence of wrongdoing, they couldn't hold him. That haunting detail gnawed at me. Who was this person, and what had they wanted? For the next few days, every time I stepped outside, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. The memory of that car parked so close to my house, the driver waiting in the shadows, stayed with me. Even though they were gone, the eerie sense of being watched lingered, as if the car might reappear at any moment. It was unsettling how something so simple, a car parked on the street, could stir such deep, chilling fear. I started noticing every vehicle that passed by, every stranger who walked too close. My once quiet neighborhood now felt like a place full of unseen dangers, each one hiding in plain sight. It's strange how quickly your sense of safety can be ripped away. The haunting thought that someone had been watching me, for who knows how long, kept playing over in my mind. I never saw that car again, but the experience left its mark. The quiet of the night, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Every time the wind rattled the windows or a car passed by, I tensed, half expecting to see that same vehicle back in its spot. Even though the police had caught the driver, the questions of why and what if haunted me, lingering like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I'd just gotten home, the weight of the day still hanging on my shoulders. I tossed my bag down and noticed something odd. The back door was ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. A sudden chill ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly? Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. The eerie thought that someone could be inside lingered, gnawing at my nerves. I crept closer, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then I heard it. A soft creak from inside the house. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't the house settling. Someone was in there. My mind raced, and instinct kicked in. I turned to leave, but before I could make it out the door, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving toward me. Panic set in. Without thinking, I bolted down the stairs into the basement, my legs moving faster than my thoughts. The door slammed behind me, and the sound echoed, making the fear even more real. The basement was dark and damp, the only light coming from a small, flickering bulb. I frantically scanned the room for a place to hide, my mind racing. I could hear footsteps above me now, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The sound of those footsteps sent a chilling wave of terror through me. I dove behind an old stack of boxes, crouching down and trying to keep my breathing quiet. Though my heart was pounding so loudly, I feared it might give me away. Time seemed to stretch as I sat there, hiding in the eerie silence. The footsteps grew closer, moving down the stairs with haunting precision. I could barely see through the darkness, but I knew whoever was in my house was getting closer. The fear was paralyzing. Every creak of the stairs, every rustle of movement, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I felt trapped, cornered like prey, with nowhere to go. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open, and I heard the intruder enter. My breath hitched and I froze, hoping the shadows would hide me. The eerie sound of footsteps grew louder as they moved across the floor, searching. It was then that I realized how vulnerable I was. Alone in the dark, in the basement of my own home, being hunted by a stranger. The air was thick with tension, and the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I peeked out from behind the boxes, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The figure was close, far too close. He was methodical, moving slowly, scanning the room like he knew I was there. Every second felt like a lifetime. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Should I make a run for it? But there was no way I could outrun him in this cramped space. I was trapped, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Just as I thought he might discover me, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Hope flickered inside me, but I knew it wasn't over yet. The intruder heard them too, and for a moment, he paused. The eerie silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. Then, without warning, he bolted back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing loudly as he made his escape. Relief flooded over me, but it was tinged with a haunting sense of unfinished business. The police arrived not long after, but by then, the intruder was long gone. They searched the house but found no trace of him, no fingerprints, no clues. It was as if he had been a ghost, slipping in and out of my life without leaving a single mark. But the fear he left behind was very real, and it clung to me like a second skin. That chilling feeling of being hunted in my own home stayed with me for days. I couldn't shake the sense of vulnerability. The basement, once just a storage space, now felt like a place of terror, a reminder of how close I had come to real danger. Even with new locks and an alarm system, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The haunting memory of those footsteps, of being chased into the dark, played over and over in my mind. I knew the intruder was gone, but the fear that someone could so easily enter my world remained. Weeks later, I still found myself listening for footsteps, especially at night. Every little sound sent a fresh wave of fear through me, a reminder of how quickly safety can slip away. The basement became a place I avoided, the darkness there feeling alive with the memory of that chase. It was haunting to realize how easily your sense of security could be ripped away, how fragile the walls of your home could be. In the end, they never found out who the intruder was or why he had chosen my house. The not knowing was almost worse than the event itself, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread. The eerie thought that he could come back, that he was still out there somewhere, stayed with me. I learned to lock my doors more carefully, to check the windows before bed. But no amount of security could erase the haunting memory of that night, of being chased into the dark with nowhere to hide. It had been a long weekend away, and I was finally home, looking forward to relaxing. Everything seemed in place as I stepped inside, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I walked into my bedroom, I noticed something strange. One of my blankets had been moved. Now, I'm not someone who fusses much over my room, but I always leave my bed neat before going anywhere. A chill crept up my spine. The room felt different, like it had been disturbed. Maybe I was just tired, I thought, brushing it off, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I scanned the room, looking for anything else out of place. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint shuffle. My pulse quickened. The sound was coming from the bathroom. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe something had fallen? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The noise had an eerie, deliberate quality to it, like someone was moving slowly, trying not to be heard. The fear set in, cold and sudden. I could feel my heart racing as I took a tentative step toward the bathroom door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but before I could turn it, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Someone was inside. There was no mistaking it now. The soft thud of footsteps on the bathroom tiles sent a chilling wave of terror through me. Whoever was in there hadn't expected me to be home. Panic surged through me. My first instinct was to run, but something held me in place. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the door, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Who could it be? Why were they in my house? The eerie thought of someone hiding in my bathroom while I was gone was haunting. I couldn't think clearly. My only focus on getting out of the house without drawing attention to myself. I moved as quietly as I could, making my way toward the front door. Every second felt like a lifetime, my footsteps echoing in my ears. I could still hear the faint movement behind the bathroom door, and the thought of being discovered sent a fresh wave of fear through me. My fingers fumbled with the doorknob, shaking so badly that I could barely turn it. I was so close to getting out when I heard the bathroom door creak open behind me. I didn't wait to see who it was. My survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted out the door, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode out of my chest. The cold night air hit my face, but I didn't stop running until I reached the sidewalk. Only then did I turn around, breathless, expecting to see someone chasing after me. But the door remained closed, and the house loomed dark and quiet behind me, like a chilling reminder of what I had narrowly escaped. I called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed. Waiting for them felt like an eternity, the eerie silence of the street doing nothing to calm my nerves. My mind raced with terrifying scenarios. Who had been in my house? What were they planning to do? I couldn't stop imagining the worst. Someone waiting in the shadows, watching me, knowing I would eventually come home. When the police arrived, they searched the house, going room by room. I stood outside, watching the lights from their flashlights flicker through the windows, my stomach in knots. After what felt like forever, one of the officers emerged, his expression unreadable. They had found the intruder, a man hiding in my bathroom closet. He had no explanation for being there, just a chilling silence that sent a shiver down my spine. They arrested him, but the fear didn't go away. The thought that someone had been living in my house, moving through my space while I was away, was deeply unsettling. The eerie quiet of my home now felt sinister, every shadow hiding the memory of that night. Even though he was gone, the presence of that man lingered in the air, haunting every corner of the house. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the fear. Every time I entered the bathroom, I half expected to see someone standing there, waiting. The sound of footsteps, the soft shuffle of movement, those memories were burned into my mind, and no amount of security could make them go away. My home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap, filled with unseen dangers. The police couldn't tell me much about the man they had arrested. He was a stranger, someone with no known connection to me. That was the most haunting part. He could have been anyone, and he had chosen my home. I kept wondering how long he had been there, how much he had seen. The thought was chilling, leaving me with a lingering sense of vulnerability that wouldn't fade. Even now, I can't step into the bathroom without thinking about that night. The memory of finding someone in my house, lurking in the shadows, is something that will stay with me forever. It's not just the fear of what could have happened, It's the eerie realization that it did happen, and that my home was never as safe as I thought it was. I've always been the type to keep to myself. The neighborhood was quiet, and although I didn't know my neighbors well, I liked it that way. That's why, when I woke up in the middle of the night to find my neighbor standing in my living room, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart nearly stopped. There he was, a man I'd only exchanged a few polite nods with, standing in the dark, holding what looked like a spare key. The eerie silence between us stretched for what felt like hours. He looked startled, like he wasn't expecting to be caught. "I was sleepwalking," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. The excuse seemed absurd, especially since he was holding a key, my spare key. My mind raced with questions. How did he get that key? Why was he in my apartment? The fear creeping up my spine turned to full-blown panic as the situation began to sink in. I was alone in my home, and this stranger had just let himself in. Still half asleep, I struggled to process everything. My instincts screamed at me to call the police, but my body felt frozen, trapped in that moment of shock. He stood there trying to explain himself, but nothing he said made sense. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, too calm, too rehearsed, as if this wasn't the first time he had been inside my apartment. That realization was chilling. How many times had he done this before? My voice finally returned, shaky and low. "You need to leave," I managed to say, stepping back toward the door. He didn't argue. He gave me a strange, almost knowing look before quietly walking out. The door clicked shut behind him, but the fear remained. My hands shook as I locked the door, double-checking it over and over. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The eerie thought that this man had been inside my apartment, possibly more than once, haunted me. I barely slept that night. Every sound felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the intruder who had just left. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. He had access to my home whenever he wanted. My apartment, which had always felt like my safe haven, now felt violated. The thought of him walking around while I was sleeping, completely unaware, was chilling. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I called the police and told them everything. As I explained the situation, the officer on the other end of the line seemed just as shocked as I was. They told me they would send someone over to investigate. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. That eerie feeling of being watched, of being invaded, wouldn't go away. The police arrived, took my statement, and knocked on my neighbor's door. He answered, acting like nothing had happened. He stuck to his story about sleepwalking, claiming he had no idea how he'd gotten my key. But something about his calm demeanor was off, like he knew something I didn't. The police didn't seem convinced either. They asked him more questions, and after some back and forth, they took him down to the station for further questioning. I should have felt safe again, knowing that he was gone for the time being. But the fear lingered, haunting every corner of my apartment. As the hours passed, I started to think about the bigger picture. How long had he had that key? Had he been inside before? The eerie possibility that he had been watching me for weeks or months sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the thought that he had used the key to invade my space, to learn my habits. It was chilling to think that while I went about my daily routine, completely oblivious, he had access to my entire life. Later that day, the police returned with an update. My neighbor was arrested for unlawful entry, but the more unsettling part was that he had multiple spare keys to other apartments in the building. Apparently, he'd been collecting them, making copies whenever someone gave him a chance. The officers assured me that the situation was under control, but their words didn't take away the fear that had settled deep inside me. My sense of security had been shattered. I changed the locks immediately, but it didn't make me feel safer. The eerie thought that someone could enter my home without me knowing was now a reality I couldn't escape. Every time I stepped into my apartment, I felt a shadow of doubt. Was I truly alone? The memory of him standing in my living room, in the dead of night, holding that key, it stuck with me like a nightmare that wouldn't fade. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I started locking my doors obsessively, checking the windows multiple times before bed. But no matter how many precautions I took, the haunting reality was that my privacy had been invaded in the most personal way. My neighbor, someone I barely knew, had been watching me, and that thought was chilling enough to keep me on edge for weeks. It was a quiet night, just like any other. I was curled up on the couch, half watching TV, my mind more focused on unwinding after a long day than the show itself. The house was silent, with only the occasional flicker of the screen breaking the darkness. But that stillness shattered when I heard something, an unmistakable noise coming from the back deck. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill creeping down my spine. At first, I thought it could have been the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. I muted the TV and listened more carefully. The noise came again, a soft scraping sound, like someone or something was climbing up the deck. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, frozen. The eerie quiet of the house only made the sound seem louder. Slowly, I turned toward the back of the house, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving outside the glass door. Someone was trying to break in. Panic surged through me. For a split second, I just stared, hoping that maybe it was all in my head. But then, I saw the figure more clearly, their hands pressed against the glass, trying the handle. My blood ran cold. The door was locked, thank God, but that didn't make me feel any safer. The thought of someone so close trying to get inside was chilling. I jumped up from the couch, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I confront them? Call for help? I moved as quietly as I could, trying not to alert the intruder. My phone was in the kitchen, just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. The fear of being seen, of the glass door giving way, made my every step feel heavier. I could hear the intruder fumbling with the door, testing it, as if they were looking for a weak point. The sound was haunting, slow, methodical, like they had all the time in the world. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. As I waited for someone to pick up, I ducked into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My heart raced as I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation as quickly and quietly as I could. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but it didn't ease the tension. They told me to stay put, that officers were on their way. But with every passing second, the fear grew. What if the intruder managed to get in before help arrived? Sitting there, huddled in the bathroom, I could still hear them outside, moving from the door to the windows. They were persistent, trying every possible entry point. The glass rattled under their attempts, and the eerie thought of them getting inside made my skin crawl. I could picture it. This stranger stepping into my home, invading my space. The thought was paralyzing. The bathroom, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. I was trapped, with nowhere to go. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the intruder's attempts. My breath caught in my throat. Had they given up? Or worse, had they found another way inside? I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. The eerie stillness weighed down on me, each second feeling like a lifetime. Finally, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. Relief washed over me, but the fear lingered. I stayed put, waiting for any sign that the police had arrived. Moments later, I heard voices outside and the unmistakable knock of law enforcement at my front door. I unlocked the bathroom door and rushed to the living room, my legs shaking beneath me. The officers searched the deck and the perimeter of the house, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. They found scratches on the glass door and marks on the railing where someone had clearly climbed up. But there were no other clues, no sign of who it had been or why they had chosen my house. It was as if they had vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but the eerie memory of their attempt. The police assured me they would patrol the neighborhood, but the fear didn't fade. Even after they left, I couldn't shake the haunting feeling that someone had been outside, so close to getting in. The thought of what could have happened if that door hadn't been locked was terrifying. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every little creak of the house sending a fresh wave of panic through me. I installed extra locks the next day, along with a security system. But no matter how many precautions I took, the memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I looked at the deck, I imagined that shadowy figure, their hands pressed against the glass, trying to get in. It was a chilling reminder of how fragile the sense of safety really is, how quickly it can be shattered. Even now, I can't sit in the living room without glancing at the back door, half expecting to see someone lurking outside. The break-in didn't happen, but the fear of what could have been is just as haunting. My home, once a place of peace and quiet, now feels different. The shadows seem darker, the quiet more unsettling. That night changed everything, and the eerie sense of vulnerability has never quite left. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening at home. My parents were out for the night, leaving me alone to watch TV and relax. The house felt safe and familiar, the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But that comforting feeling didn't last long. Around dusk, while scrolling through my phone, I noticed movement outside through the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was an animal, or maybe just my imagination. But when I glanced up, my heart skipped a beat. There was a man in the yard, standing just at the edge of the bushes, barely visible in the fading light. I froze, unsure of what to do. He wasn't moving, just watching. The eerie stillness of the figure sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it was probably someone passing by, maybe lost or confused. But the longer I looked, the more I realized he wasn't going anywhere. He was just standing there, staring directly at the house. The unease crept up on me slowly at first, but it didn't take long for fear to settle in. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he just a random stranger? Or was this something more sinister? I tried to shake off the dread and went to the window, peeking through the blinds, hoping he'd be gone. But no, he was still there, standing even closer now, moving slowly toward the house. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the panic starting to rise. Who was he, and what did he want? I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call someone. But what would I say? Hey, there's a guy standing in my yard? It sounded ridiculous in my head, but the eerie feeling that something was very wrong wouldn't go away. Just as I decided to call the police, I heard the soft sound of tapping on the glass. My heart leaped into my throat. He was at the window now, close enough to see inside. His face was hidden by the shadows, but I could see the outline of him, still watching. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking as I tried to dial. My fingers fumbled and I dropped the phone, the clatter echoing through the quiet house. That sound felt too loud, too obvious, like it had given me away. I held my breath, hoping he hadn't heard it. But then the tapping came again, more insistent this time, and I knew he wasn't going to leave. The sense of being trapped, alone in the house with this man outside, was suffocating. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, but I hesitated. What if he was already there, waiting? I couldn't take that chance. My mind raced as I ran toward the back, planning to slip out the back gate and head to the neighbor's house. But as I reached the kitchen, I heard the sound of the back door rattling. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was trying to get inside. The eerie sound of the door handle turning sent a wave of terror through me. I ran back toward the front of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows along the front wall showed the yard stretching out before me, but no sign of the man. I had no idea where he was now, and the uncertainty made the fear even worse. I felt like a mouse trapped in a cage, with the predator closing in from all sides. I grabbed my keys and made a break for the front door. My only thought was to get out, to run as fast as I could. I didn't care where, just away from him. As I yanked open the door, the cool night air hit me, and I sprinted across the yard, not daring to look back. I could hear my own footsteps pounding against the pavement, echoing in the quiet street. The neighbor's house was only a few doors down, but it felt like miles in that moment. I reached the door and pounded on it with everything I had, my heart racing, barely able to catch my breath. The seconds felt like hours as I waited for someone to answer. When my neighbor finally opened the door, I stumbled inside, gasping out a frantic explanation. They didn't hesitate. They called the police immediately. The fear still gripped me, but at least I wasn't alone anymore. Help was coming. The police arrived and searched the yard, but by then, the man was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But the eerie presence he left behind didn't disappear so easily. The memory of him standing there, watching me, still haunts me to this day. I kept asking myself why he was there, what he wanted, and the not knowing was almost worse than the event itself. That night changed everything. Even now, when I'm home alone, I can't help but check the windows, making sure no one is lurking outside. The sense of safety I once had in my own home is gone, replaced by a constant, nagging fear that someone might be watching. It's chilling to think how easily that man had turned my life upside down, without ever saying a word, without ever stepping inside. It was late, well past midnight, and I was deep into a gaming session, the kind where hours slip by unnoticed. My parents had gone to bed long ago, and the house was completely still. The only sounds were the clicks of my controller and the hum of the console. It was peaceful in a way, until I heard it. A knock, soft but unmistakable, echoed through the house. My heart skipped a beat. I paused the game and listened. It was coming from the front door. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. But the eerie part was, it came again. 3 slow knocks, more deliberate this time. The sound made my stomach tighten with unease. Who would be knocking at this hour? My neighborhood wasn't the type where strangers just show up in the middle of the night. I muted the TV and crept toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. The street outside was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. No sign of anyone at the door. My pulse quickened as I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the night. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing, but the unsettling feeling gnawed at me. I turned back toward my room, ready to dismiss it all, when I heard another knock. This time, it wasn't at the front door, it was at my bedroom door. I froze, my body going cold. How could that be possible? No one else was awake, and I hadn't heard anyone come inside. The thought that someone was now inside the house, standing just outside my bedroom door, sent a chilling wave of terror through me. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Slowly, I backed away from the door, the fear wrapping itself around me like a vice. The knocks came again, this time more insistent, like whoever was on the other side knew I was inside. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move. The eerie silence that followed each knock was suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I glanced around the room, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was on the bed, but I wasn't sure if calling someone would help. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. In the dim light of my bedroom, shadows seemed to stretch and shift, playing tricks on my mind. Every creak of the house made my nerves fray even more. The door handle rattled slightly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Someone was definitely there, right outside, and the reality of it sank in hard. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed further into the corner, not daring to make a sound. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The silence was eerie, oppressive, making the wait feel like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to figure out who it could be. A prank? A burglar? But the most chilling thought of all was the possibility that the person outside knew I was alone, and that they had been watching me all along. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the knocks themselves. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house. I finally gathered the courage to inch toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the knob. I didn't want to open it, but the not knowing was worse. Slowly, I cracked the door open, just enough to peer out into the hallway. It was empty, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I stepped into the hallway, glancing down toward the front door. The house was as still as it had been all night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, standing just outside my room. My pulse pounded in my ears as I carefully checked the rest of the house, but there was no sign of anyone. I returned to my room, locking the door behind me. but the sense of security I once had was gone. Even though I hadn't seen anyone, I knew they had been there. The eerie reality that someone had knocked on my bedroom door without a sound leading up to it haunted me. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the chilling thought that someone had been inside the house, right outside my door, without me knowing. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a bad dream, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The knocks, the rattling door handle, it had been real. And the fact that I never saw who it was made it all the more terrifying. Even now, the memory of that night lingers, a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we see, but the ones we don't. It started as an ordinary afternoon. I was home alone, lazily flipping through TV channels while the house creaked and settled around me. You know that comforting quiet that fills the house when you're by yourself? That's what I was feeling, until I heard something that shattered the peace. It wasn't a usual house noise. It was subtle at first, a faint shuffling sound coming from above, like something, or someone, was moving around in the attic. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon, but something about the way the sound lingered felt wrong. I turned off the TV, straining to hear better. The shuffling continued, followed by what sounded like faint footsteps. My heart started pounding in my chest as the eerie realization hit me. It wasn't an animal. Someone was in the attic. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but the unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach kept growing. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing with what to do next. Then, without warning, I heard it. A thud like something heavy had fallen. My breath caught in my throat and my eyes darted toward the ceiling. The fear that had been slowly building up inside me exploded into full-blown panic. I wasn't alone in the house. My mind raced through all the possibilities, none of them good. Who was up there? And how had they gotten in without me noticing? My first instinct was to run outside, but something stopped me. I needed to know what was going on. Quietly, I crept toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. The ladder to the attic was still folded up, but the thought that someone could be just above me, watching, was chilling. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze of potential danger. I hesitated, unsure of whether to investigate or call someone for help. Before I could decide, the sound of the attic door creaking open made the decision for me. My blood ran cold as I watched the ladder slowly descend. I backed away, trying to stay as quiet as possible, my pulse racing. The air was thick with tension as I saw a pair of legs appear, followed by the rest of a figure. A man, tall, gaunt, and unfamiliar, was climbing down from the attic, moving slowly as if he didn't want to be heard. My stomach twisted in fear. He had been hiding up there, and now he was inside the house. I ducked into my bedroom and slammed the door, locking it with shaky hands. My mind was racing. Who was this man, and why had he been in the attic? The fear was overwhelming. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. Every second I spent waiting for help felt like an eternity. I pressed my ear to the door, listening to the eerie sounds of the man moving around the house, his footsteps unnervingly calm. It wasn't long before I heard the front door creak open. He was trying to leave, to escape before the police arrived. The thought of him walking freely through my house as if it was his own sent a chill down my spine. I stayed hidden in my room, barely breathing, until the sound of sirens broke the eerie silence. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with lingering fear. Even with the police on their way, the damage was done. The police arrived quickly, and I listened as they searched the house. It didn't take long for them to find the man. He hadn't gotten far. He was hiding in a closet near the back door, as if he was still waiting for the right moment to slip away. They arrested him, but the fear didn't fade. The questions racing through my mind only grew louder. How long had he been in my attic? What had he been planning? Later, the police told me they found makeshift bedding and food stashed in the attic. He had been living there for days, maybe even weeks. The eerie thought of someone watching me from above moving silently while I went about my life, was more terrifying than the actual encounter. He had been so close, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come down. Even after they took him away, the haunting sense of violation lingered. My home no longer felt like the safe, comfortable place it had once been. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound from the ceiling, sent shivers down my spine. The thought that he could have been watching me from the attic for who knows how long kept replaying in my mind. It was a fear that wouldn't go away, no matter how many locks I installed or how many times I checked the attic door. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone was still watching me. The attic, once a forgotten space, now felt like the center of my nightmares. I found myself checking it constantly, afraid that another stranger might be hiding up there. The memory of that man climbing down the ladder, slowly and deliberately, is something that still haunts me. The fear of what could have happened lingers, reminding me how easily the safety of home can be shattered. It was late, and I was driving home after a long day. The roads were empty, the kind of eerie quiet that makes the night feel endless. My mind was on autopilot, just wanting to get home, when I saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. Her car was pulled over with the hood up, and she looked desperate, her figure barely visible under the flickering streetlight. Something about it seemed off, but I couldn't shake the sense of duty to help. I slowed down and rolled down my window just a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out, keeping my distance. The woman rushed over, her face contorted with worry. "My car broke down. Can you help?" "Please," she said, her voice trembling. The way she spoke, so urgent and pleading, tugged at my instincts. But there was something in the back of my mind, something eerie about the whole situation that made me hesitate. Despite the unease creeping up my spine, I considered pulling over completely. But then, just as I was about to step out, I noticed something chilling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Two men, barely visible, creeping around the side of the car. They had been hiding, waiting in the shadows. My heart leaped into my throat. This wasn't just a broken-down car, it was a trap. I slammed the gear into reverse, my mind racing. The woman's expression changed in an instant, from pleading to something much darker. She backed away, her hands still outstretched as if to keep the act going, but her eyes betrayed her. Fear surged through me as I hit the gas and sped backward, trying to put as much distance between myself and the ambush as possible. My pulse pounded in my ears as I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the two men rush out from behind the car, their figures barely visible in the night. They ran toward my car, and for a second, I thought they might catch up. But as I sped down the road, leaving them behind, my thoughts raced even faster. What if I hadn't seen them? What if I had gotten out of the car? The eerie realization of how close I had come to being their victim sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the kind of fear that sinks deep into your bones, leaving you shaken long after the danger has passed. I drove for a few more minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see them chasing after me. The night had taken on a new, more sinister quality. Every shadow seemed to hide another potential danger, and the road ahead felt longer and darker than before. I finally pulled over in a well-lit parking lot, my heart still racing as I dialed the police. When they arrived, I explained what had happened, recounting the eerie encounter with the woman and the two men lurking behind her car. The officer listened carefully, but the fact that they had disappeared into the night made it hard for them to do much. They promised to patrol the area, but the helplessness in their eyes mirrored my own feelings. Whoever they were, they had planned this, and it wasn't their first time. That thought was chilling. I couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, the way her expression had shifted from desperation to something more sinister. It was haunting how quickly the situation had changed, how easily I could have fallen into their trap. The memory of those men emerging from the shadows played over and over in my mind, reminding me of how close I had come to danger. That sense of vulnerability, of being hunted, stayed with me long after the night ended. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the events in my head, wondering what would have happened if I had gotten out of the car. The thought was chilling. What could they have wanted? Robbery? Something worse? The not knowing made it even more terrifying. Every time I passed a broken-down car on the road, my stomach would tighten with fear. The eerie memory of that night had left its mark, making me question even the simplest of situations. It wasn't just the fear of what could have happened, it was the haunting realization that these people had used someone's trust, someone's instinct to help, against them. That betrayal was what stayed with me the most. The next time I saw a car broken down on the side of the road, I didn't stop. I couldn't. The fear had taken root too deeply, leaving me questioning every encounter, every plea for help. In the end, the police never caught the group. They seemed to disappear as quickly as they had appeared. But the fear they left behind was very real. The memory of that night, of being lured into a trap so easily, still haunts me. It's chilling to think that something as simple as trying to help someone could turn into a nightmare. And every time I drive that same road, I find myself glancing into the shadows, wondering if they're still out there, waiting. I had just gotten home from work, feeling relieved to finally unwind after a long day. My roommate was out for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. As I walked up the front steps, I noticed something odd. The back door was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. My roommate had been gone for hours, and I was sure she wouldn't have left the door open. I hesitated at the threshold, a cold chill creeping up my spine. I told myself it must have been the wind, that maybe we had forgotten to lock it the last time we used it. I called out, half expecting to hear my roommate answer back, but the house was silent. That silence felt heavier than usual, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the living room, and that's when I saw it. There, just inside the doorway, was a man standing completely still. My heart jumped into my throat as our eyes met, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a neighbor? A friend of my roommate? But deep down, I knew he wasn't supposed to be there. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and the way he stood so still, almost too calm, set off every alarm bell in my mind. I didn't know what to do. Run? Scream? Confront him? My body refused to move, paralyzed by fear. Before I could react, the man took a step toward me. That small movement snapped me back into reality, and I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor as I rushed toward the basement. My breath came in short, frantic bursts as I slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it. My heart raced in my chest as I listened, my ear pressed against the door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. He was following me. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My mind raced with terror. I had left my phone in the kitchen. Of course, it was on the counter, charging, completely out of reach. The footsteps grew closer, and I heard him try the handle of the basement door. The door rattled, but thankfully, the lock held. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like I couldn't get enough air. I looked around the basement, searching for somewhere to hide. My eyes landed on the storage room, a small closet filled with boxes and old furniture. It wasn't much, but it was my only option. I hurried inside, crouching behind a stack of boxes, and tried to quiet my breathing. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a small window high on the wall. I prayed that the man would give up, that he would leave before finding a way in. Minutes felt like hours as I listened to the sound of him moving around upstairs. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the occasional thump of something being knocked over. He was searching the house, but for what? My pulse raced, and every noise sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. I couldn't shake the image of him standing in the living room, staring at me with that blank expression. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. My blood turned to ice as I realized he had found a way inside. I held my breath, my entire body trembling as I heard his footsteps descend the stairs. Each step echoed in the stillness, slow and deliberate, as if he knew exactly where I was hiding. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying that he wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart pounded in my ears, and I dared to peek around the edge of the boxes. Through the dim light, I could see him standing at the far end of the basement, facing away from me. He was dragging something. A chair, maybe, but I couldn't see what he was doing. Before I could process what was happening, my eyes caught movement through the small window. Red and blue lights flickered outside, illuminating the room with a faint, strobing glow. Relief flooded through me as I realized the police had arrived. They must have seen the open door or received a call from a neighbor. The man stopped, his head snapping toward the window. I could see his body tense, and then, without a word, he bolted up the stairs. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard the sound of police officers shouting commands. It felt like an eternity before I finally stepped out from behind the boxes, my legs shaky and weak. When I reached the top of the stairs, an officer was standing in the hallway. He looked at me with concern, his hand on his radio. "We've got him," he said, his voice steady. "He's not going anywhere." I nodded, too shaken to speak. As they escorted me outside, I saw the man being led to a squad car in handcuffs. He didn't resist, didn't say a word, just that same blank, emotionless stare. The officers assured me I was safe, but even as I stood in the light of the flashing police lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never forget the way he had stood there, waiting for me in my own living room. It was a quiet late night, and I had just settled down in front of the TV when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a soft, insistent tap, tap, tap. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, far too late for anyone to be visiting. I froze, unsure of what to do. I lived alone, and visitors at this hour were never a good sign. The knocking came again, this time louder, more urgent. A chill ran down my spine as I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe someone in need of help. But what I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing there, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the porch light. He wasn't someone I recognized, and his posture was unnervingly still. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. I stepped back, my mind racing. I didn't know this man, and there was no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door at this hour. My first instinct was to call the police, but something about the way he stood there, completely silent, unnerved me. I felt trapped in my own home, the thin barrier of the door the only thing separating me from this stranger. The knocking started again, more forceful this time. "I need to come in," a voice said from the other side. It was calm, almost too calm, and that terrified me more than anything. Whoever this man was, he didn't sound frantic or desperate, just insistent. I didn't respond, too afraid to even breathe. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this someone looking for trouble? A lost traveler? Or was it something worse? "I know you're in there," the man said, his voice cold and steady. My heart leaped into my throat. How did he know? I hadn't made a sound. The house was dark, and I hadn't turned on any lights. I backed away from the door slowly, my hands trembling. My phone was on the coffee table, just a few feet away, but even reaching for it felt like it would make too much noise. I didn't want him to hear me. Suddenly, the man's voice changed. "Let me in," he demanded, his tone now harsh, almost angry. The soft tapping had turned into loud, frantic pounding. He was hitting the door with such force that it rattled in its frame. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as quietly as I could. The operator told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, but calm was the last thing I felt. I huddled in the corner of the living room, my eyes glued to the front door. The pounding continued, relentless, as the man outside became more agitated. "You can't hide forever," he shouted. The sound of his fists hitting the door echoed through the house, and I feared the door wouldn't hold much longer. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. I didn't dare move. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. Had he given up? Or was he still out there, waiting? My fingers tightened around the phone, ready to call the police again if I had to. I heard footsteps moving away from the door, slow and deliberate, like he was pacing the front yard. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I waited, hoping the police would arrive before anything worse happened. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the curtains. The man was gone. I didn't feel relief. I felt a deeper, more unsettling fear. Like he was still out there, hiding in the shadows, watching. Moments later, the flashing lights of a police car filled the street. The officers knocked on the door and I let them in, still shaking from the encounter. They searched the yard and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police assured me that they would patrol the neighborhood and keep an eye out, but the encounter left me rattled. That night, I locked every window and door, double-checking everything twice. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every gust of wind against the house made me sit up in bed, heart racing, convinced the man had come back. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't gone. I started noticing small things. Footprints in the garden, a window left slightly open when I knew I had closed it. The faint feeling of being watched when I walked through the house at night. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew that the man at the front door hadn't left. He was still out there, somewhere, waiting for another chance to knock. The storm rolled in faster than I had expected. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the windows in relentless sheets. I had always loved thunderstorms, the way they made the world outside feel distant and untouchable. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to the storm, something more menacing in the way the wind screamed through the cracks in the house. I tried to ignore the unease growing in my chest and focused on the book in my hands, telling myself it was just another rainy night. The house creaked under the weight of the storm, but that was normal. I told myself that houses always made noises during bad weather. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and the occasional roll of thunder shook the walls. The rhythm of it all was almost hypnotic, and I started to relax, letting myself get lost in the pages of my book. But then, I heard it. Something that didn't belong with the storm. A soft knock. At first, I dismissed it. It had to be the wind, a loose branch tapping against the glass, or maybe even the rain hitting just right. I returned to my book, but a minute later, it came again, this time louder. A clear, deliberate knock on the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked up from the page, listening intently. The knock came again, insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I got up from the couch and moved toward the window, my footsteps soft on the wooden floor. The curtains were drawn, but I hesitated before pulling them back. I didn't want to look. Something about the knock felt wrong, like whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't supposed to be there. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the curtain aside slowly and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the storm, wild and chaotic, and the trees swaying violently in the wind. The yard was empty, as far as I could tell. I let out a shaky breath, relieved but still unnerved. I was about to turn away when another knock came, this time so loud it made me jump. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. The knock hadn't come from the front window, though. It had come from the side, near the back of the house. Panic started to creep in. Someone was out there, knocking on my windows in the middle of a storm. I moved quickly to the side window, peeking through the curtain, but again, there was nothing. Just rain, wind, and shadows. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but something stopped me. What was I going to say? That someone was knocking on my windows? In this weather? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. The storm was raging outside, and surely that was all it was. Just the storm. But then, the knock came again. This time, it was right behind me, on the window next to the couch. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my pulse racing. The curtains fluttered slightly from the draft, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow on the other side of the glass. I jumped up and ran to the front door, making sure it was locked. Every door, every window in the house was suddenly a potential entry point for whatever or whoever was outside. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone seeking shelter from the storm, or was it something far more sinister? I double-checked the locks, my hands shaking as the rain lashed against the house. I stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do next. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I strained to hear any other sounds beyond the storm. But then, without warning, a loud bang erupted from the back of the house. It sounded like something had hit the window hard, like a fist or a rock. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy book, and crept toward the back window. My nerves were frayed, and every step felt like it was bringing me closer to something I didn't want to see. When I finally reached the window, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the curtain, and I took a deep breath before pulling it back. There, in the darkness, was a figure. Just beyond the window, standing motionless in the rain, staring at me through the glass. The lightning flashed, illuminating the figure for a brief moment. It was a man, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was drenched from the storm, his clothes clinging to his body, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring. I didn't know what to do. My phone was still in my hand, and I quickly dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. They told me to stay inside, that officers were on their way. But the minutes felt like hours as I stood there, staring at the man who refused to leave. When the police arrived, I ran to the door, opening it quickly and pointing toward the window. But when they checked, the man was gone. The backyard was empty, and the only sign that anyone had been there was a single, muddy footprint just outside the window. The officers assured me they would patrol the area, but I knew they wouldn't find him. That night, I barely slept. The image of that man, standing in the rain, watching me through the window, haunted my dreams. And even now, during every storm, I find myself listening for the knock at the window, waiting for him to return. It was a long night, and I was exhausted by the time I finally made it home. The drive had taken longer than expected, and the rain had started pouring just as I pulled into the driveway. The house was dark. The soft hum of crickets drowned out by the heavy patter of raindrops against the roof. I was too tired to notice anything odd as I fumbled for my keys, eager to get inside and collapse into bed. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I was greeted by the familiar scent of the house, slightly musty, with a hint of the lavender air freshener I had always used. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the rain outside. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and made my way to the bedroom, not bothering to turn on any lights. Everything felt like second nature, even in the dark. I shrugged off my jacket, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. The mattress felt a little firmer than I remembered, but in my tired state, I didn't give it much thought. I drifted off almost immediately, the sound of the rain soothing me to sleep. For a while, everything was peaceful, until I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange feeling. Something wasn't right. I sat up in bed, blinking groggily, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I glanced around the room. That's when I noticed it. This wasn't my bedroom. The bed, the walls, even the layout of the room. Everything was different. Panic shot through me as I realized I wasn't in my house at all. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How had I gotten here? I scrambled out of bed, my pulse racing as I fumbled for the light switch. When the light flickered on, my stomach dropped. I was in a stranger's bedroom. The furniture was different, the pictures on the walls unfamiliar, and the clothes hanging in the closet weren't mine. I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I realized what I had done. I had broken into the wrong house. My mind raced with fear and confusion. How had I made such a huge mistake? Everything had felt so familiar when I arrived. The driveway, the front door, even the scent of the house, it had all seemed like mine. But now, standing in a stranger's bedroom, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I had let myself into someone else's home, thinking it was my own. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what to do next. My heart raced as I realized that whoever lived here could return at any moment, or worse, they might already be home. What if they heard me come in? What if they were just in another room, too scared to confront the intruder in their house? I had to leave. Now, I grabbed my jacket from the floor, moving as quietly as I could. Every step felt like a risk, every creak of the floorboards threatening to give me away. I tiptoed down the hallway, trying to remember the path I had taken in my half-asleep state. My mind was still foggy from exhaustion, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me alert. As I passed the living room, my heart nearly stopped. There was a light on, a faint glow coming from under the door of another room. Someone was awake. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, praying I could get out before they realized I was here. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the front door, silently begging it not to squeak. Finally, I managed to slip outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the tension in my chest hadn't eased. I turned around, looking at the house that wasn't mine, my mind still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The driveway, the front steps, it all looked so similar to my place, but it wasn't. How could I have made such a mistake? I hurried back to my car, parked neatly in front of the house. It was only then, as I sat behind the wheel, that I realized my true home was just a few doors down. The houses in the neighborhood looked eerily alike, especially in the dark and rain. I had let exhaustion and routine guide me, and I'd ended up in the wrong place entirely. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart still racing. I was safe now, but the thought of what could have happened gnawed at me. What if the homeowners had found me in their bed? What if they'd called the police? I couldn't even begin to explain how mortifying that would have been. I started the engine and slowly drove the short distance to my actual house, my mind still reeling from the experience. When I pulled into my own driveway, I made sure to check every detail: the mailbox, the porch light, even the garden gnome by the steps. This was my house, no doubt about it. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the sense of familiarity washed over me like a balm. I was home, finally. I collapsed onto my own bed, feeling the relief in every muscle. But even as I drifted back to sleep, I couldn't shake the image of that other house, of the mistake that could have turned into a nightmare. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, but thankful that the strange night was behind me. I couldn't help but laugh at my own absurdity, falling asleep in the wrong house, of all things. It would make a funny story one day, but for now, I was just glad I had gotten out before things could take a turn for the worse. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something far more sinister. And every time I passed that house on my street, I'd glance over, wondering if the owners ever noticed the signs of an unexpected guest who had wandered into their home in the dead of night, thinking it was their own. It was a quiet night, the kind where the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I had just settled down with a book, savoring the peaceful evening after a long day. The house felt cozy, and the dim glow of the lamp by the couch gave the room a warm ambience. Everything felt perfect. Until I heard it. A noise, faint but unmistakable, came from the backyard. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or maybe a stray animal. But then I heard it again, a soft shuffling sound like footsteps on the grass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to listen. The sound was subtle but deliberate, too precise to be the wind. Someone, or something, was out there. I stood up slowly, my body tense with unease. The backyard was dark, only lit by the dim light from the windows. I walked over to the sliding glass door that led to the deck, my breath shallow as I peered out into the night. At first, I saw nothing, just the familiar outline of the trees and the fence. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure. A man was standing near the back of the yard, partially obscured by the shadow of the trees. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. He was just standing there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I couldn't make out his face in the darkness, but the sight of him sent a chill down my spine. I quickly locked the sliding door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. The man hadn't moved, but the tension in the air was palpable. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but every minute felt like an eternity as I stood there, watching the intruder. The man shifted slightly, taking a step closer to the house. My heart raced, and I backed away from the door, praying that the lock would hold. I couldn't understand why he was just standing there, not moving, not saying anything. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. Suddenly, he took another step toward the house. My stomach lurched as he reached out and tried the door handle, rattling it softly. I bolted for the bathroom, locking myself inside. My breath came in short gasps as I crouched in the small space, waiting for the police to arrive. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sound from the backyard, but all I could make out was the soft creak of the deck outside. The minutes dragged on, and every creak and groan of the house felt like a threat. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he trying to break in? Was he armed? I had no idea what he wanted or how far he was willing to go. All I could do was wait, my heart pounding in my chest as I clutched my phone, praying for the police to arrive. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief flooded through me as the sound grew closer, and I dared to unlock the bathroom door. I crept back to the living room and peeked through the curtains. The man was gone. The yard was empty, the only evidence of his presence being the faint impressions of footprints in the grass. When the police arrived, they searched the property but found no sign of the intruder. The officers told me that they would patrol the area throughout the night and assured me that it was probably just a would-be burglar, spooked by the approaching sirens. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The way he had just stood there, watching the house in silence, it didn't feel like a random break-in attempt. It felt more deliberate, like he had been waiting for something. That night, I double-checked every lock, every window, and every door. Sleep didn't come easily, and when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with the image of the man standing in the backyard, his face obscured by the shadows. Even after the police had left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might come back. In the days that followed, I kept an eye on the backyard, always looking for any sign that the man had returned. But the yard remained empty, quiet, and still, just as it had been before that night. Yet every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. The sense of unease never really went away, lingering in the back of my mind. Months later, the memory of that night still haunts me. I moved out of that house not long after, but the thought of someone watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike, still sends chills down my spine. And sometimes, when I look out into the backyard of my new home, I can't help but wonder, what if he's still out there, watching and waiting? It was well past midnight when I woke up to the sound of soft creaking in the hallway. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. The house was old, and it often made strange noises at night. I blinked groggily, listening for a moment, but the sound didn't come again. Deciding it was nothing, I rolled over and closed my eyes, hoping to drift back to sleep. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone stepping cautiously across the floor. My eyes snapped open, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. I strained to hear, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was silent now, but that didn't comfort me. Something was wrong. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat as I listened more intently. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the faint glow of the screen casting an eerie light across the room. As I unlocked it, another creak echoed from the hallway, closer this time. My stomach dropped. It was unmistakable now. Someone was out there, walking down the hall toward my bedroom. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. My heart pounded in my ears as I crept toward the bedroom door, my body tense with fear. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath as I listened. The footsteps had stopped, and the house had fallen into an oppressive silence. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, too afraid of what might be waiting on the other side. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I debated whether to call out, but something deep inside told me to stay silent. My phone was clutched tightly in my hand, and I considered calling the police, but part of me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if it was just the house settling, or an animal that had gotten in? I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but then I heard a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the wall. My breath hitched in my throat, and I instinctively stepped back from the door. Whoever was out there was close. Too close. I crept back toward the bed, my mind racing with fear. I couldn't hide in here forever. I needed to do something. Just as I was about to make a move, the door handle rattled softly. My heart leaped into my throat, and I stifled a gasp. I froze, staring at the door in horror as the handle turned slightly, but didn't open. Whoever was on the other side seemed to hesitate, as though they were testing the door. My legs felt weak, and I backed up against the wall, pressing myself into the corner of the room. The door remained closed, but I knew someone was there. I could feel their presence, a heavy weight pressing against the door, as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. My phone buzzed softly in my hand, and I glanced down at it, realizing that I still hadn't called for help. I quickly dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I explained the situation. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me that officers were on their way. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The door handle stopped moving, but I could still hear the faint sounds of movement just outside. Every second felt like an hour, and the fear gnawed at me, making it hard to breathe. I huddled in the corner, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My only hope was that the police would arrive before whoever was in the hallway decided to come in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The blue and red lights flashed through the window, casting strange, flickering shadows across the room. I heard the front door creak open, followed by the voices of the officers as they called out to announce their presence. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, until one of the officers knocked gently on my bedroom door. "It's safe now," he said, his voice steady. I opened the door slowly, my body still trembling with fear. The officers were there, their flashlights illuminating the hallway. But when I stepped into the hallway, my stomach dropped. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been inside. The officers reassured me that they had searched the house thoroughly, but they couldn't find anything, or anyone. It was as if whoever had been standing in the hallway had vanished without a trace. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that the creaks and noises were simply the house settling. But deep down, I knew that someone had been there, standing just outside my door, waiting. Even now, long after that night, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. It had been a long, exhausting day at work, and I was more than ready to kick off my shoes and relax. My apartment building was usually quiet, especially during the late hours, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I unlocked the door to my unit, dropped my bag on the floor, and immediately collapsed onto the couch. It felt good to be home. Just as I was getting comfortable, I heard a knock at the door. It was a soft, tentative knock, almost as if the person wasn't sure whether they should be knocking at all. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late. Maybe it was one of my neighbors, though I didn't know many of them very well. Curious, I got up and walked over to the door, peeking through the peephole. Standing outside was a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed casually, jeans and a jacket, but there was something about him that immediately put me on edge. His posture was tense, and he kept glancing nervously down the hallway. He didn't look familiar, and my building wasn't the kind where strangers often wandered around. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The man's head snapped toward me, and his eyes widened as if he was surprised that I had actually answered. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said quickly, his voice shaky. I'm your neighbor. I just moved in down the hall, and I don't have a phone. I was wondering if I could borrow yours for a minute." A chill ran down my spine. Something about his request felt off. First of all, I had been living in this building for a while, and I knew for a fact that no one had moved in recently. Secondly, why would anyone be without a phone in this day and age? It didn't make sense. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I considered what to do. "Sorry, I'm not comfortable with that," I said, tightening my grip on the door. "Maybe you can try the building manager's office?" The man's face darkened for a moment, and I could see a flicker of something, frustration maybe, cross his features. But then he smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "No problem," he said, his voice still a little too eager. "I understand. I'll just try someone else." Without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. I shut the door and locked it, a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. Something wasn't right about that encounter. He wasn't my neighbor, and his story didn't add up. Why had he chosen my apartment, and what was he really after? I tried to shake off the feeling of dread as I returned to the couch. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. What if he was still lurking around the building? I checked the peephole again, half expecting to see him standing outside my door, but the hallway was empty. An hour passed, and I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting when I heard something. A faint scratching sound, like someone fiddling with a door down the hall. My blood ran cold. Was it him? I turned off the TV and sat in silence, listening intently. The scratching continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole again. This time, I saw him. He was standing in front of one of my neighbor's doors, looking around as if to make sure no one was watching. He seemed to be trying to open the door with something in his hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. He wasn't a neighbor. He was trying to break in. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building security, my hands shaking. I whispered into the receiver, explaining what I was seeing. The security guard assured me that they would be up immediately. But the minutes dragged by as I watched the man continue his attempts to open the door. Every moment felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and the man froze. He glanced around one last time before quickly slipping down the stairs, disappearing into the building's lower levels. The security guard arrived moments later, but the man was already gone. They searched the building but couldn't find him. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, every sound making me jump. Even though the man was gone, the sense of vulnerability lingered. He had chosen my building, knocked on my door, and lied to my face. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had let him in. In the days that followed, I learned that the man had been spotted at several other apartment buildings in the area, always with the same story about being a new neighbor and needing to borrow a phone. He was never caught, and eventually, the sightings stopped. But every time I hear a knock at my door now, I'm reminded of that night, of the stranger who could have been anyone, but was no one at all. The vacation had been going perfectly. My family and I were at the beach, soaking in the sun and enjoying a much-needed break from our daily routine. The sand, the waves, the carefree laughter of the kids, it was everything we had hoped for. But in the middle of the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from our home security system. I almost didn't check it. We had set up cameras around the house for peace of mind, and in the past, false alerts had come from animals or wind. But something about this notification felt different. When I opened the app, my heart sank. The front door camera had detected motion, but none of our neighbors were supposed to be around. The timestamp was only minutes old. I clicked the live feed, and my stomach dropped when I saw the door slowly creak open. There was no one in sight at first, just the eerie emptiness of the living room visible through the front door. I watched with bated breath, waiting, hoping it was some kind of glitch. But then, a figure stepped into view. A man, dressed in dark clothing, moving cautiously through the entryway. My hands started shaking as I realized what was happening. Someone had broken into our house while we were miles away on vacation. The man looked around as if making sure the coast was clear, and then he disappeared from the camera's view. I frantically called my wife over, and we watched together as the intruder moved room to room, rifling through our belongings. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. I dialed the local police, explaining the situation as best as I could while keeping an eye on the live feed. The intruder was now in the kitchen, pulling drawers open, rummaging through our things. My mind raced with panic. How long would it take the police to get there? And what would this man do in the meantime? Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The intruder moved with purpose, almost as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. He went through the living room, then into the master bedroom. Seeing him in our personal space, where we slept, where we lived our lives, made me feel sick. He started opening the closets, inspecting things quickly, and then he paused, turning his head as if he'd heard something. Suddenly, the camera feed cut out. My heart leaped into my throat as the screen went black. I tried refreshing the app, hoping it was just a momentary glitch, but the connection wouldn't come back. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had found the camera. Panic surged through me. Now I had no way of knowing what was happening at the house. I felt powerless, helpless. The police assured me they were on their way, but we were hundreds of miles away, and there was nothing we could do but wait. My mind filled with dark scenarios. What if he had backup? What if he was destroying everything? Our home, the place we felt safest, was being violated by a stranger. After what felt like hours, the police finally called back. They had arrived at the house and found the front door wide open, but the intruder was gone. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The officer told me that the house had been ransacked, with drawers emptied and personal items scattered everywhere. Oddly enough, nothing valuable seemed to be missing. Jewelry, electronics, and even cash had been left behind. It didn't make sense. If this had been a robbery, why hadn't he taken anything of value? The officer told me they would continue investigating, but the whole situation felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder hadn't been there for the usual reasons. He had gone through our things, yes, but what had he been looking for? When we finally returned home a couple of days later, walking through the front door felt like entering a stranger's house. The air inside was heavy with an unsettling stillness, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violation. Our personal belongings had been rifled through, left in disarray, but just as the police had said, nothing of real value was missing. For weeks after, we tried to move on, but something had changed. The sense of security we once had in our home was gone. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound outside made me jump. I installed more cameras, reinforced the locks, and did everything I could think of to make the house feel safe again. But no amount of security measures could erase the memory of knowing that a stranger had walked through our lives, unseen and unknown. We never found out who the intruder was or why he had broken in. The police had no leads, no fingerprints, nothing to go on. It was as if he had come and gone like a ghost, leaving behind only the uneasy feeling that he might return one day. To this day, I can't shake the thought that he wasn't there for material things. He was looking for something else, something we never figured out. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear the faintest sound outside or the soft hum of the security cameras, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next time our house is left unguarded. It had been a long day, and by the time I returned home, all I wanted was to relax. The house was quiet, just the way I liked it after a busy day. I was sure I had locked the front door when I left that morning. Double-checked it, actually. But as I approached the house, something felt off. The door wasn't fully closed. It was ajar, just slightly, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the crack of the open door. I had locked it, right? I couldn't have been careless. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart racing in my chest. Everything seemed normal at first glance. No signs of a break-in, no damage. I stepped inside cautiously, glancing around the living room. Nothing appeared to be out of place. Maybe I had forgotten to pull it closed all the way before leaving. That thought settled my nerves, at least for a moment. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I walked through the house, checking each room. The kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom. Everything was in its place. I was starting to feel a little silly for panicking. I had probably just been distracted when I left this morning, I reasoned. After all, nothing was missing, and the house was locked up tight when I returned, except for that slightly open door. I locked the door again, this time making sure it clicked firmly into place. Then I settled into the couch, turning on the TV to distract myself from the lingering tension. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just my paranoia getting the best of me, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been in the house. Hours passed, and the unease slowly faded. I managed to relax a bit as the familiar background noise of my favorite show filled the room. But then, just as I was starting to feel comfortable, I heard a soft creak from down the hallway. My blood ran cold. It was so faint, barely audible over the sound of the TV, but unmistakable. It sounded like the creak of a door opening. I muted the TV and listened intently, my heart thudding in my ears. The house was silent again, but the tension was back, heavier than before. I got up, my muscles tense with fear, and walked toward the hallway. The doors to all the rooms were shut, just as I had left them earlier. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was palpable. I approached the bedroom door, the one I had shut behind me when I finished checking the rooms. The door was slightly open now. My breath caught in my throat. I had definitely closed it. There was no draft, no reason for it to have opened on its own. My pulse quickened as I stood in the hallway, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know what was on the other side. With trembling hands, I slowly pushed the door open, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The room was just as I had left it, neat, undisturbed. But something felt different. I scanned the room carefully, and then I saw it. The window. It was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking all the windows before I left that morning. I always did. But now, this one was open, just a crack. Panic set in. I backed away from the window, my mind reeling. Someone had been in the house. They had opened the window, probably to escape, knowing I was about to return. That would explain the slightly ajar front door. My stomach churned with the realization that someone had been inside while I was gone, moving through my space, opening doors and windows. I rushed back to the living room and called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what had happened. They arrived quickly and searched the house thoroughly. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of anything having been stolen, but the unlocked window and the open door couldn't be explained away. The officers assured me they would patrol the area, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Whoever had been in the house knew what they were doing. They had come and gone without a trace, leaving only subtle signs of their presence. The idea that they might return kept me up that night, every creak and groan of the house making my heart race. Days passed, and I tried to forget about the incident, but the memory lingered in the back of my mind. I changed the locks, installed more security measures, and checked the windows obsessively. But no amount of preparation could erase the feeling that the intruder might come back. It wasn't just the fear of someone breaking in. It was the knowledge that they had done it without leaving a trace. Weeks later, I came home one night to find the front door slightly ajar again. This time, I didn't go inside. I stood on the porch, staring at the door, the same cold dread washing over me. I had locked it. I was sure of it. But the door, just like before, was open, barely, but enough to make my heart pound in my chest. Someone had been inside again, and this time, I wasn't going to wait to find out what they had done. It was late, and I was driving home after a long day. The roads were empty, the kind of eerie quiet that makes the night feel endless. My mind was on autopilot, just wanting to get home, when I saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. Her car was pulled over with the hood up, and she looked desperate, her figure barely visible under the flickering streetlight. Something about it seemed off, but I couldn't shake the sense of duty to help. I slowed down and rolled down my window just a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out, keeping my distance. The woman rushed over, her face contorted with worry. "My car broke down. Can you help?" "Please," she said, her voice trembling. The way she spoke, so urgent and pleading, tugged at my instincts. But there was something in the back of my mind, something eerie about the whole situation that made me hesitate. Despite the unease creeping up my spine, I considered pulling over completely. But then, just as I was about to step out, I noticed something chilling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. 2 men, barely visible, creeping around the side of the car. They had been hiding, waiting in the shadows. My heart leaped into my throat. This wasn't just a broken-down car, it was a trap. I slammed the gear into reverse, my mind racing. The woman's expression changed in an instant from pleading to something much darker. She backed away, her hands still outstretched, as if to keep the act going, but her eyes betrayed her. Fear surged through me as I hit the gas and sped backward, trying to put as much distance between myself and the ambush as possible. My pulse pounded in my ears as I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the 2 men rush out from behind the car, their figures barely visible in the night. They ran toward my car, and for a second, I thought they might catch up. But as I sped down the road, leaving them behind, my thoughts raced even faster. What if I hadn't seen them? What if I had gotten out of the car? The eerie realization of how close I had come to being their victim sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the kind of fear that sinks deep into your bones, leaving you shaken long after the danger has passed. I drove for a few more minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see them chasing after me. The night had taken on a new, more sinister quality. Every shadow seemed to hide another potential danger, and the road ahead felt longer and darker than before. I finally pulled over in a well-lit parking lot, my heart still racing as I dialed the police. When they arrived, I explained what had happened, recounting the eerie encounter with the woman and the 2 men lurking behind her car. The officer listened carefully, but the fact that they had disappeared into the night made it hard for them to do much. They promised to patrol the area, but the helplessness in their eyes mirrored my own feelings. Whoever they were, they had planned this, and it wasn't their first time. That thought was chilling. I couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, the way her expression had shifted from desperation to something more sinister. It was haunting how quickly the situation had changed, how easily I could have fallen into their trap. The memory of those men emerging from the shadows played over and over in my mind, reminding me of how close I had come to danger. That sense of vulnerability, of being hunted, stayed with me long after the night ended. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the events in my head, wondering what would have happened if I had gotten out of the car. The thought was chilling. What could they have wanted? Robbery? Something worse? The not knowing made it even more terrifying. Every time I passed a broken-down car on the road, my stomach would tighten with fear. The eerie memory of that night had left its mark, making me question even the simplest of situations. It wasn't just the fear of what could have happened, it was the haunting realization that these people had used someone's trust, someone's instinct to help, against them. That betrayal was what stayed with me the most. The next time I saw a car broken down on the side of the road, I didn't stop. I couldn't. The fear had taken root too deeply, leaving me questioning every encounter, every plea for help. In the end, the police never caught the group. They seemed to disappear as quickly as they had appeared. But the fear they left behind was very real. The memory of that night, of being lured into a trap so easily, still haunts me. It's chilling to think that something as simple as trying to help someone could turn into a nightmare. And every time I drive that same road, I find myself glancing into the shadows, wondering if they're still out there, waiting. I woke up in the middle of the night to the faint sound of footsteps, and for a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. You know, those late-night creaks and groans houses tend to make when everything is quiet, but this wasn't that. These were distinct, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly, as if someone was carefully making their way through my home. My heart raced, but I didn't move, frozen by the eerie feeling that something was very, very wrong. I lay there, straining to listen, my mind running wild with possibilities. Could it be the wind? Maybe the house settling? But deep down, I knew better. The sound was too real, too chilling. I slowly sat up, my eyes scanning the dark room, searching for any signs of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening, like the calm before a storm. Gathering every ounce of courage, I got out of bed, my feet barely touching the floor as I tiptoed toward the hallway. The house felt colder than usual, as if something or someone was lurking nearby. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out every other sound. As I peered into the hallway, I saw nothing, just the familiar darkness. But the air felt different. Heavy, almost suffocating. I checked every room, flipping on lights as I went, hoping to dispel the creeping dread that had settled in my chest. Each empty room was both a relief and a disappointment. I wanted to believe I was just imagining things, but the atmosphere was too thick with unease. By the time I returned to my bedroom, I was convinced it had to be in my head. I crawled back into bed, trying to shake off the haunting feeling that something was still off. The next morning, the daylight brought a sense of calm, but it didn't last long. As I was getting ready, something caught my eye in the living room. A window I was certain I had closed was now slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I had always been meticulous about locking up before bed, so how could I have missed this? I walked over, my fingers brushing the cold glass, and noticed the faintest smudge on the window frame. Someone had been here. Panic set in as I retraced my steps from the night before. I had checked the house, hadn't I? How could I have missed this? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had the intruder been inside while I was sleeping? The thought made my skin crawl. The sense of safety I had always felt in my own home was now completely shattered, replaced by a deep, unsettling fear. I immediately called the police, explaining everything. How I had heard footsteps, how I found the window, the smudge. They arrived quickly, taking notes, asking questions, but ultimately, there was little they could do. No signs of forced entry, no clear evidence that anyone had been there besides the window. They assured me they would patrol the area, but left me with an uneasy reassurance that there wasn't much to worry about. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind had me on edge, convinced that the intruder would return. I stayed up, listening, waiting, the shadows in my home playing tricks on me. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, but the tension hadn't eased. The house no longer felt like my own. It felt invaded, haunted by something unseen but deeply felt. Days passed and I tried to move on, but the eerie feeling lingered. I installed extra locks, bought security cameras, and even considered moving. But no matter what I did, the fear stuck with me like a shadow, always lurking just out of sight. The police never found any leads, and eventually they stopped coming by. But I knew that someone had been there, watching me, waiting. And the worst part, I never found out who it was or what they wanted. That chilling uncertainty is what keeps me up at night. Even now, every time I hear the slightest creak, I can't help but wonder, was it all over, or were they just waiting for the right moment to come back? It all started with a message from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a wrong number or some prank, so I didn't give it much attention. But as the messages continued, the tone became chilling. The person on the other end seemed to know far too much about me. Details no stranger should ever know. My daily routine, the clothes I wore, even the exact time I left my house in the mornings. The worst part? Every time I blocked the number, another one would pop up, always watching, always knowing. At night, things escalated. I'd hear noises, soft at first, like the house settling or the wind brushing against the windows. But then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, just like the texts had described. Whoever it was, they were nearby, close enough to make my skin crawl. I'd rush to the windows, but there was never anyone there. It was like the intruder was a ghost haunting me, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. One night, the silence was broken by the sound of a floorboard creaking just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze in bed, barely breathing. The text had come only moments before. "I'm closer than you think." I stared at the door, expecting it to open at any second, revealing the person who'd been tormenting me for weeks. But nothing happened, just the unbearable sound of silence swallowing the room whole. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed the police, whispering my fear into the receiver. They told me to stay calm, that they would be there as quickly as possible. I stayed frozen in my bed, clutching the phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The minutes dragged on like hours, each second filled with the tension of not knowing whether I was alone or being watched. By the time the police arrived, the house was eerily still. They searched every room, every closet, and every corner, but there was no sign of an intruder. Nothing had been disturbed, no windows broken, no doors forced open. It was as if the whole thing had been in my head. But I knew better. That creak, those texts, they were too real, too terrifying to be a figment of my imagination. The officers reassured me, telling me they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood. But I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was overreacting, paranoid even. I couldn't blame them. With no solid evidence, it did seem like a nightmare I was creating for myself. But the fear was real. The anxiety was real. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over yet. The next night, I installed security cameras around the house. I figured if I couldn't see him, maybe the cameras would. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that someone was out there. But when I checked the footage the following morning, there was nothing. Just empty streets, swaying trees, and the stillness of the night. No shadowy figure, no movement, nothing to explain the growing terror gnawing at me. Then came the knock. It was late, almost midnight, and I had been sitting in the living room, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But that knock shattered my fragile sense of security. I walked to the front door slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. I peeked through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, just the faint echo of the knock still reverberating through the house. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. That's when I heard it again, the creak of the floorboards, but this time it was inside the house. I spun around, every nerve in my body on high alert, but once again, nothing. No intruder, no sign of forced entry, just the oppressive feeling that someone was watching me. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, and no matter how much I tried to escape it, the stalker always seemed to be one step ahead. The police came again, but there was nothing they could do. With no clear evidence of a break-in, it was my word against the empty rooms of my house. They suggested I stay with a friend for a few nights, just to clear my head. So I did. I packed a small bag and left the house, locking the door behind me. But as I drove away, a familiar vibration came from my phone. Another text. "You can't run forever." I turned pale. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I glanced into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing. Just my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with fear. I kept driving, heart racing, knowing that even if I left, even if I tried to escape, the stalker would always find a way back into my life. And that's the scariest part. There was no way to know when or how they'd strike next. It started innocently enough, just a few odd noises here and there. My partner and I would hear faint creaks coming from the closet in our bedroom, but we always brushed it off as the house settling. After all, houses make strange noises sometimes, right? But over time, those creaks became more frequent, almost like soft footsteps. We joked about it, nervously laughing as we passed by the closet, But deep down, we couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something wasn't quite right. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, we were sitting in the living room when we heard it again, the unmistakable sound of movement coming from our bedroom. I looked at my partner, my heart beginning to race. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, hoping they would brush it off like usual. But this time, their face mirrored my fear. We both stood up, frozen in place, listening to the eerie creaking that seemed to echo through the walls. Gathering our courage, we tiptoed down the hallway toward the bedroom, the floorboards creaking under our feet. The closer we got, the more distinct the noises became. Rustling, soft thumps like someone, or something, was moving inside our closet. My hand tightened around the doorknob, and I took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The room was dark and still, except for the faint rustle coming from the closet. It was enough to send chills down my spine. We flicked on the light, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. The closet stood there, innocuous as ever, the door slightly ajar. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. As I pulled it open, the closet was empty. Just clothes, shoes, and a few boxes scattered at the bottom. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to laugh off the strange experience, but it didn't feel funny anymore. Something was wrong, and we both knew it. The next few nights were the worst. The noises didn't stop. They got louder, more persistent. Every night it was the same, creaking, rustling, as if someone was moving around inside our closet. One night, I could have sworn I heard breathing. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. I nudged my partner awake, and we both sat there, listening in terrified silence. The breathing stopped as soon as we turned on the light, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We finally decided to investigate further. We pulled everything out of the closet, clothes, boxes, even the old suitcases that hadn't been touched in years. That's when we found it. A small, hidden compartment in the back, one we'd never noticed before. It was just big enough for someone to squeeze through. My blood ran cold as we opened it, revealing a crawl space that led deeper into the walls of the house. Someone had been there. The police were called immediately. They searched the crawl space, finding clear signs that someone had been living there for days, possibly even weeks. Old food wrappers, a blanket, and a flashlight were tucked away in the narrow passage. The officers told us we were lucky to have found it when we did. Whoever had been hiding there had easy access to our room, watching us while we slept. The thought made my skin crawl. The scariest part was that the intruder was never caught. They had disappeared by the time we discovered the hiding spot, leaving behind only the chilling evidence of their presence. The police suggested they might have been coming and going through a window or a back door, slipping in and out without us ever noticing. But why? What were they waiting for? The unanswered questions gnawed at us. We moved out of that house soon after. There was no way we could stay. Not after knowing someone had been living in the walls, watching us so closely. The memories of those eerie nights followed us, though. Every creak of the floorboards in our new place made us jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. We tried to move on, but the feeling of being watched never really left. Even now, I catch myself glancing at closets, checking them twice before I go to bed. The thought that someone could be hiding just out of sight has become an obsession. It's something you never forget. And sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I swear I can still hear those faint footsteps, rustling just beyond the door. We never found out who the intruder was, what they wanted, or why they chose us. The mystery of it all haunts me to this day, like a ghost that refuses to fade. Every time I walk past a closet, I can't help but wonder, what if they're still out there, watching someone else now, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows? It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my family first heard the noise. We were all in the living room, lazily watching TV, when the distinct sound of something moving came from the guest room. At first, we thought it was nothing, maybe a draft or the old house settling. But when the noise happened again, louder this time, we exchanged uneasy glances. The guest room had been locked for weeks. No one had been inside since our relatives visited a month ago. So, what could possibly be making that sound? I suggested we check it out, but the rest of the family seemed hesitant. The locked room had always given us an eerie feeling, though none of us could explain why. Still, the noise persisted, growing more unsettling by the minute. Finally, curiosity got the better of us, and we made our way to the door. My father turned the handle only to find it locked, just as it had been all this time. The key was nowhere to be found, but the noises were undeniable. Something or someone was inside. We decided to force the door open, and after a few tries, it gave way with a loud crack. The room was exactly how we had left it. Furniture covered in dust sheets, windows shut tight. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unsettling atmosphere hung heavy in the air. We cautiously stepped inside, checking every corner, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. It was as if the room had been disturbed by a ghostly presence. Just as we were about to leave, the door slammed shut behind us. We all jumped, my heart racing as I rushed to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone or something was holding it closed from the other side. Panic set in as we all pushed against the door, but it was no use. We were trapped inside the room that had been locked from the outside, and that's when the noises started again. This time, much closer. A faint whisper echoed through the room, sending chills down my spine. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. We searched frantically, pulling back dust sheets, checking under the bed, but found nothing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though we still couldn't make out what was being said. My mother clutched my arm, her face pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Whatever was in the room with us wasn't human. Minutes felt like hours as we tried everything to get out. My father banged on the door, shouting for help, but the rest of the house seemed eerily silent. No one outside could hear us. It was as though we had been cut off from the rest of the world, trapped in this locked room with something we couldn't see but could definitely feel. The air grew colder, the whispering now constant, and we all huddled together, terrified of what might happen next. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, and for a brief moment I thought it was over. But just as quickly, a loud thud came from the closet. We all turned to look, our breath caught in our throats. The closet door, which had been closed, was now slightly ajar. No one dared move. We were frozen in place, each of us silently praying that whatever was in there would stay hidden. My father, always the brave one, slowly approached the closet. He pulled the door open, revealing a completely empty space. Relief washed over us, but it didn't last long. As soon as he stepped back, the whispers returned, this time right behind us. We spun around, but the room was still empty. Something was toying with us, playing a chilling game we didn't understand. In a desperate attempt to escape, we tried the door again. To our shock, it opened easily this time, as if whatever had been holding it shut had simply let go. We practically stumbled out of the room, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. We locked the door again, and this time we agreed never to go back in there. Whatever was in that room didn't want us there, and we didn't want to test our luck any further. For weeks, we avoided the guest room. But late at night, we could still hear the faintest of noises, whispers, soft thuds, as though the room was still alive with its eerie presence. We considered moving out, but the thought of leaving only increased our anxiety. What if we left, only to have the same thing happen in our new home? The house, with all its strange occurrences, had become part of us. Even now, the guest room remains locked, untouched, as though it's frozen in time. No one dares to enter, and every time we pass by, we hold our breath, half expecting to hear that familiar whisper again. The mystery of the locked room has never been solved, and I'm not sure it ever will be. But one thing's for sure, some doors should never be opened, no matter how curious you might be. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because suddenly, there was a loud crash as they bolted toward the back door. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps racing across the floor, followed by the sound of the door slamming. They were gone. The tension in my body began to ease, but my heart was still racing. I stayed hidden until the police finally arrived, bursting through the front door, weapons drawn. They searched the house thoroughly, but the intruder had managed to escape into the night. When I finally stepped out of the closet, I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over me. The police assured me that they would patrol the neighborhood, but the fear of being alone in the house lingered. It wasn't just the break-in that haunted me. It was knowing that someone had been inside while we were asleep, and they had gotten so close. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the chilling sense of vulnerability. I had always thought of my home as a safe place, but that illusion had been shattered. Every noise made me jump, and I found myself double-checking locks and windows obsessively. The police never caught the person who broke in, but they believed it was a random burglary. Still, the idea that they might come back haunted my every thought. The break-in had been a wake-up call for me. I installed new security measures, reinforced doors, and added cameras around the house. But no matter how many precautions I took, the memory of that night wouldn't fade. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light outside, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. It was as though the intruder had left a permanent mark on our lives, one that couldn't be erased. Eventually, life started to return to normal, but the fear never truly went away. I still find myself lying awake at night, listening for any signs that something is wrong. Every now and then, I'll catch myself imagining those footsteps outside the bedroom door again, creeping closer and closer. The memory of that night is something I'll never forget, a reminder that safety can be shattered in an instant. It was well past midnight when I first heard the sound, glass shattering somewhere downstairs. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it or if it was a dream. My eyes shot open and I listened intently, straining to catch any other noise in the darkness. My heart started racing as the unmistakable sound of footsteps followed. Someone was in the house, and I wasn't alone. My child was asleep in the next room. Instinct kicked in immediately. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and hurried to my child's room, keeping as quiet as possible. The last thing I wanted was to alert whoever had broken in that I was awake. My heart pounded in my ears as I gently lifted my child from their bed and carried them into the closet. I whispered soft reassurances, trying to stay calm for both our sakes, but my mind was racing. Who could be inside, and what were they after? I dialed 911 as soon as we were hidden, whispering urgently into the phone. The dispatcher assured me that police were on the way, but they seemed impossibly far away at that moment. Every second felt like an eternity as I sat there in the dark, clutching my child close, trying to keep them from waking up and making any noise. The intruder was still moving downstairs, opening drawers, knocking things over, as if they were searching for something. The thought that they could come upstairs at any moment terrified me. I strained to listen for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, praying that they would stay downstairs until help arrived. The house was eerily silent for a few moments, but then I heard it, the creak of a floorboard. They were coming up. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, almost like they were savoring the moment. I braced myself, my body tensing as the steps stopped right outside the bedroom door. I could hear my pulse in my ears, my hands shaking as I clutched my phone. The door handle jiggled slightly, and I thought for sure this was it. They were going to find us. But just as quickly as the footsteps had approached, they retreated, moving back down the stairs. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, updating them on every noise I heard. The intruder was now rummaging through the living room, and the fear of them coming back upstairs kept me frozen in place. I had never felt so helpless in my life, just sitting there in the dark, waiting for the police to arrive, hoping they'd get there before the intruder realized we were upstairs. It was the longest wait of my life. When I first moved into my new house, everything seemed perfect. It was a quiet neighborhood, just the kind of peaceful escape I needed. The house was charming, with its cozy rooms and a backyard that bordered a small forest. I thought it would be a fresh start, but it didn't take long for things to feel off. At first it was small, almost unnoticeable changes. A book moved from the coffee table to the bookshelf, a light left on that I was sure I had turned off. I chalked it up to stress and the whirlwind of moving, but the feeling of being watched never left. I started to notice more subtle changes, little things that gnawed at my peace of mind. The kitchen cabinets would be slightly ajar when I came downstairs in the morning. My shoes, which I always left neatly by the door, would be askew, like someone had kicked them aside. It was as if someone had been walking through the house when I wasn't there. But that seemed impossible. I lived alone, after all, and there was no sign of forced entry or anything truly alarming. The feeling of unease crept into my everyday life. I found myself growing more paranoid, checking the locks 3 or 4 times before bed, making sure all the windows were shut tight. But no matter how careful I was, the strange disturbances kept happening. A framed picture of my family was turned upside down one morning, and I knew for sure that I hadn't touched it. It sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After a particularly unsettling week, I decided to take action. I bought a set of security cameras, hoping that seeing everything with my own eyes would put my mind at ease. I set them up around the house, focusing on the living room, kitchen, and front door. For the first few nights, nothing unusual happened. The cameras recorded empty rooms and quiet hallways. I almost started to relax, thinking maybe I had been overreacting. But then, on the 3rd night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed a man moving silently through my living room in the middle of the night. He wasn't hurried or frantic. He moved as if he had been there before, familiar with the space. He went through my things, examining the books on the shelf, touching the framed photos. But the most chilling part was that he didn't take anything. He just observed. I watched in horror as he walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, disappearing from view. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt nauseous knowing that someone had been inside while I slept. I called the police immediately, showing them the footage. They searched the house and the surrounding property but found no sign of the intruder. There were no broken windows, no forced doors. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they would increase patrols in the area, but the lack of any concrete evidence left me feeling more vulnerable than ever. The man on the footage was real. I called the police immediately, showing them the footage. They searched the house and the surrounding property, but found no sign of the intruder. There were no broken windows, no forced doors. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they would increase patrols in the area, but the lack of any concrete evidence left me feeling more vulnerable than ever. The man on the footage was real, and he had been inside my home. But where had he gone? For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every sound jolted me awake. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a threat. I moved through the house as quietly as possible, always on edge, expecting to see that man again. But he never reappeared, at least not on camera. That's what terrified me the most. I had no idea if he had stopped or if he had simply found a way to avoid being caught on tape. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the soft creak of a floorboard just outside my bedroom. My heart raced, but I stayed still, holding my breath. I didn't dare check the cameras. I didn't want to see him again. The creaking stopped after a few moments, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the man was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception, unseen but ever present. I moved out of that house not long after. I couldn't take the constant paranoia, the sense that someone was always watching me. Even now, in my new place, I still feel that unease sometimes. I still check the locks obsessively, still wake up at the slightest sound in the night. But the worst part is the not knowing. What did he want? Why didn't he take anything? And how long had he been watching me before I noticed? The footage from that night still haunts me. I can't bring myself to delete it, even though it terrifies me to watch it. It's the proof that something truly sinister had been happening right under my nose, and I had no idea. I wonder if the new owners of that house feel the same eerie presence, or if the unseen stranger has moved on to someone else. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that man. his silent footsteps, or the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. I first noticed the odd noises coming from the basement not long after I moved in. At first it was just a faint tapping sound, like pipes rattling or the house settling. I didn't think much of it. After all, old houses make weird noises, right? But as the days went on, the tapping grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes it would happen late at night, waking me up in the middle of my sleep. Each time I would convince myself it was nothing, but the sound gnawed at me. Deep down, I felt something was off. One evening, after hearing the tapping for the third time that day, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The air was cooler down there, thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The basement was a cluttered mess of old boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten things left behind by previous owners. I checked every corner, but there was nothing unusual, just the same clutter I'd seen a dozen times before. Yet, as I stood there in the dim light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The tapping stopped for a while after that, but it wasn't long before it started up again, this time accompanied by strange creaks and thuds. Every night, it seemed to get louder, more persistent, until it became impossible to ignore. One night, I finally decided enough was enough. I went down to the basement again, determined to figure out what was causing the noise. That's when I found it. A door I had never noticed before, hidden behind an old bookshelf. It was small and unassuming, almost blending into the wall. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it, shining my flashlight on the rusty hinges. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. How had I missed it before? I reached for the handle, but something inside me hesitated. The air around the door felt different, heavier, colder. I had the distinct feeling that opening it would change everything. I stood there for a long time, my hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct told me to walk away, to leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, resisting, as though they hadn't been moved in years. The door led to a narrow, dark hallway, one that seemed to stretch further than the basement should have allowed. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside, my flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness. The hallway was cramped and lined with crumbling stone walls. It felt wrong, like I had stepped into another world entirely. I followed the corridor, my footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of unease became. I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I was intruding on something ancient and forgotten. And then I saw it. A small room at the end of the hall. Inside the room were remnants of what looked like a makeshift living space. A bedroll, a pile of old, moldy clothes, and an empty can of food. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what this meant. Someone had been living down here. But how long ago? And why? There was no way anyone could have accessed this space without me knowing, or so I thought. The air in the room was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in on me the longer I stood there. Suddenly, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned quickly, scanning the small space, but there was no one there. Yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to leave that dark, forgotten place behind. As I hurried back down the hallway, the tapping grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the narrow space. I reached the basement and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I locked it tight, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still down there. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the tapping, relentless and eerie, as though it was calling me back to that dark, forgotten room. In the days that followed, I tried to pretend that none of it had happened. I sealed the basement door, telling myself I'd never go back down there. But the noises never stopped. The tapping, the creaking, it was always there, lurking in the background of my life. I considered moving, but a part of me felt tied to the house, like whatever was behind that door wasn't done with me yet. Even now, I can't shake the haunting feeling that something is waiting down there in the dark. I don't know who lived in that forgotten room, or what they were hiding from, but one thing is certain: I'll never forget the day I found that door. And sometimes late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I had never opened it. We were all looking forward to a weekend of relaxation. The cabin was perfect, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, with no cell service to distract us. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise of the city and the pressures of daily life. The first day was peaceful. We spent our time hiking, grilling, and enjoying the serenity of the wilderness. But as night fell, that peaceful feeling slowly gave way to something much more eerie. It started with a flicker of movement outside the cabin window. I caught it out of the corner of my eye while we were sitting around the fireplace, talking and laughing. At first, I thought it was just the shadows from the trees playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, there it was, a figure, standing just at the edge of the woods. I couldn't make out any details, but the way the figure stood there, perfectly still, sent a chill down my spine. I nudged one of my friends and pointed it out, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just an animal or someone from a nearby cabin. But there was something about the way that figure had been watching us that left me feeling uneasy. We decided to close the curtains, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, and continue with our night. But the air in the cabin felt different now, thick with tension, as though we were no longer alone. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping noise, but it was enough to jolt me from sleep. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I heard it again, louder this time, as though something was being dragged across the porch. My heart started racing as I realized the sound was coming from just outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, and then there was a soft thud, like someone had just dropped something heavy. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my flashlight caught something. A pair of footprints in the dirt, leading away from the porch and into the woods. I woke the others, telling them what I had heard. Everyone was on edge now, and we gathered in the living room, discussing whether we should investigate. Some of my friends thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the footprints outside were clearly human. We decided to wait it out, locking all the doors and windows. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as though that stranger was still out there, lurking in the dark. Hours passed in tense silence, but just as we began to relax, we heard it again. This time it was a loud bang. Someone was knocking on the front door. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who could possibly be out here, in the middle of the night, knocking on our cabin door? No one dared move as the knocking continued, each bang more insistent than the last. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding, and called out, "Who's there?" There was no response. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving us in an eerie silence that was almost worse than the sound itself. We decided to stay inside, too terrified to confront whoever was out there. After a while, the tension seemed to ease, and we thought maybe whoever it was had left. But then we heard footsteps on the roof. We all looked up, hearts racing, as the footsteps moved slowly across the cabin. The sound of creaking wood above us sent chills down my spine. How had they gotten up there? What did they want? The footsteps circled the roof for what felt like hours before finally disappearing into the night. We stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep, listening to every little sound, every creak, waiting for the stranger to return. When morning finally came, we cautiously stepped outside, hoping the daylight would bring some sense of safety. But what we found only made things worse. There were more footprints around the cabin, circling the building, as if someone had been watching us all night long. And on the front door, scratched into the wood, was a single word: soon. We packed up and left as quickly as we could, none of us saying much on the drive home. The weekend that was supposed to be a relaxing getaway had turned into a nightmare. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, as if that stranger is still out there, waiting. The memory of that night lingers with me, haunting my dreams, and I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we had opened that door? We started looking at everyone around us with suspicion. Neighbors, friends, even family. Could someone we knew be using a spare key to enter our home? But that made no sense. No one we knew would do something so creepy, so invasive. The police didn't take our concerns seriously either, saying there was nothing they could do without any evidence of a break-in. But we knew someone was getting inside. Then, one night, we found the answer. It was late, and I had just come out of the bathroom when I heard a soft click from the front door. I peeked around the corner and saw the door slowly opening. My heart stopped as a shadowy figure stepped inside. I recognized them immediately. It was our neighbor, the one we barely knew. They stood there for a moment, looking around as if they owned the place. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as they pulled a key from their pocket. I confronted them, my voice shaking with anger and fear. They stammered, claiming they had been sleepwalking and didn't know how they had gotten the key. It was a pathetic excuse, one that didn't explain how they had been entering our home for weeks. We called the police immediately, and the neighbor was arrested, though they continued to insist it had all been a misunderstanding. But we knew better. The real horror wasn't just that someone had been inside our home, it was the fact that we had no idea how long they had been doing it. Every time we thought we were safe, they had found a way back in, using that spare key like it was their own personal invitation. Even after the arrest, the unease lingered. We changed the locks again, of course, but the feeling of violation remained. The house no longer felt like our home. We moved out a few months later. It was too much to live with, knowing that someone had been inside our private space, walking through our rooms, looking at our things. Even now, in our new place, we're hyper-aware of every creak, every noise, every time a door doesn't seem quite right. The fear doesn't go away easily. And sometimes I still wonder, what if someone, somewhere, still has another spare key? It all started with something small. Our front door would occasionally be unlocked when we returned home. At first, my partner and I thought we were just being forgetful, perhaps leaving it unlocked in a rush to get to work or run errands. We joked about it, reminding each other to double-check the locks before leaving. But soon, it became too frequent to ignore. Every other day, we'd come home to find the door unlocked. Even though we had been sure to lock it that morning, we decided to change the locks, thinking maybe the old ones were faulty. It seemed like a simple fix, and for a few days, everything seemed normal again. We both breathed a little easier, no longer worrying about the strange occurrences. But then it happened again. I came home late one evening, and there it was, the front door, slightly ajar, the lock clearly undone. This time, it felt different. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Someone had been inside, and they had used a key. The idea that someone had a spare key to our home made my skin crawl. I walked through the house, checking every room, every closet, looking for signs that someone had been there. But nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was missing. It was as if the person had entered and left without touching a single thing. That was what made it so eerie. The invasion wasn't about stealing. It was about presence. That night, I told my partner, and we both felt the growing unease. We changed the locks again, this time opting for high-security deadbolts. We even installed a security system, hoping that would be enough to put our minds at ease. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks went by without incident, and we started to relax, thinking the problem was behind us. But the feeling of being watched never truly went away. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard the sound of the front door creaking open. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at my partner, and they had heard it too. We both rushed downstairs, but by the time we reached the door, it was closed and locked, just as we had left it. The security system showed no sign of anyone entering, but we both knew what we had heard. Someone had been there. Someone with a key. The next day, we called a locksmith to change the locks once again, but this time, he gave us a strange look. He mentioned that there was no sign of forced entry, no damage to the lock mechanisms. In fact, he told us the locks hadn't been tampered with at all. It was as if whoever was entering the house had the same set of keys we did. My blood ran cold at the thought. Who could possibly have access to our house without our knowledge? It started with the footsteps. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would hear the sound of soft, deliberate steps echoing through the house. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the house was settling, or the wind was playing tricks on me. But the footsteps were too distinct, too human. They would start at one end of the hallway and slowly move toward my bedroom. By the time they reached my door, I'd sit up in bed, heart racing, listening intently, but there was never anyone there. For the first few nights, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing to worry about. But each night, the footsteps returned, always stopping just outside my bedroom door. The sound was unnerving, light, almost cautious, like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I would lie awake, frozen, waiting for the door to creak open. But it never did. The footsteps would just stop. I checked the house thoroughly the next morning, looking for any sign that someone had been inside. But everything was as I had left it. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight. There were no signs of forced entry. Yet the footsteps continued night after night, always stopping at the same spot, just outside my door. It felt like someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, the fear became too much. I started sleeping with the lights on, hoping it would deter whoever, or whatever, was causing the noises. But the footsteps persisted, undeterred by the light. One night, I mustered the courage to confront the sound. As soon as I heard the first footstep, I threw open my bedroom door, expecting to catch someone in the act. But the hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards settling under my feet. Desperate for answers, I installed a security camera in the hallway, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. I figured if the footsteps were real, the camera would prove it. That night, the footsteps came again, as they always did. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable sound of them stopping outside my door. When I checked the footage the next morning, my blood ran cold. The camera had recorded nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone walking through the hallway. But I had heard the footsteps, clear as day. It didn't make sense. How could there be no evidence? It was as if the footsteps existed in some other realm, something unseen but deeply felt. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. The next night, I decided to follow the sound. As soon as the footsteps started, I crept out of bed and into the hallway, carefully tracing the path of the sound. The footsteps moved slowly ahead of me, leading me down the hall and toward the living room. But just as they had done every night before, they vanished as soon as I reached the doorway. The house was deathly quiet, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. I called a friend to stay with me, needing someone else to hear what I had been hearing. That night, we both sat in the living room, waiting for the footsteps to begin. Hours passed, and for the first time in weeks, the house remained silent. My friend eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I stayed awake, waiting, listening. The absence of the footsteps was almost worse than their presence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I was about to drift off, the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stop outside my door. They continued down the hallway, past the living room, and toward the basement. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The basement door stood ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and descended the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with dust. I scanned the room with my flashlight, searching for any sign of the source of the footsteps. At first, there was nothing. But then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it, a small crawl space, hidden behind an old shelf. My hands trembled as I moved the shelf aside, revealing the entrance. I shined the flashlight into the crawl space, and what I found sent a chill down my spine. Inside were discarded food wrappers, an old blanket, and footprints in the dust. Someone had been living there. For how long, I couldn't tell, but the footsteps were no longer a mystery. Whoever had been living in that hidden space had been walking through my house at night, watching me and vanishing before I could ever catch them. I moved out the next day. The memory of those footsteps haunts me to this day. Every creak, every sound I hear in a quiet house brings me back to that moment, to the eerie stillness that followed the vanishing steps. I'll never know how long they had been there or why they chose to torment me, but one thing is for certain. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, fading into nothingness. It was late. Far too late to be driving alone on a deserted highway, but I was anxious to get home. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a dark ribbon cutting through miles of empty landscape. The occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars had disappeared hours ago, and now it was just me, the hum of the engine, and the faint glow of my dashboard lights. The isolation was eerie, but I tried to shake off the unease. I'd done this drive before, though never quite this late. Everything was fine until I saw it. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, far in the distance at first, but quickly closing in. I didn't think much of it, just another driver trying to make good time on an empty road. But as the car got closer, something felt off. It wasn't just the speed. The car was following me too closely, tailgating me for no apparent reason. I checked the speedometer. I wasn't going slow. Still, the car pressed closer, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. I sped up, hoping they'd pass, but they didn't. They just matched my speed, staying right behind me. My pulse quickened as I glanced in the mirror again. The car was too close, almost aggressively so, like it was trying to intimidate me. I flicked on my turn signal and switched lanes, expecting them to pass. But instead, the car swerved into my lane again, sticking right behind me. That's when I started to feel real fear. I decided to test them. I slowed down, almost to a crawl, hoping they'd get frustrated and go around me. But they didn't. They slowed down too, maintaining the same menacing distance. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. I took a deep breath and pressed the gas pedal harder, speeding up to nearly 80 miles per hour. For a moment, the car seemed to disappear into the distance, its headlights growing smaller in my rearview mirror. I thought I had lost them, but then, in an instant, the headlights were back, closer than ever. It was as if the car had materialized out of thin air, once again tailgating me, its headlights burning into the back of my car. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some reckless driver, something was wrong. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that whoever was driving that car had sinister intentions. I had to lose them, and fast. I veered off at the next exit, hoping the sudden turn would throw them off. The road was darker here, lined with thick trees, and my heart pounded as I checked the rearview mirror. To my relief, the car didn't follow. I breathed out a shaky sigh and pulled over to the side of the road, needing a moment to gather myself. The highway was quiet again, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. Just as I started to relax, I saw them. The same headlights appeared in the distance, turning off the exit and heading straight toward me. My stomach dropped. How had they found me? I slammed the car into drive and sped off, my heart racing as the car closed in behind me once more. It didn't make sense. There was no way they could have caught up so quickly. But there they were, those blinding headlights filling my mirrors again, even though I had seen them vanish. I drove faster, twisting through the back roads, trying to lose them. But no matter where I turned, they were right behind me. It was as if the car knew exactly where I was going, always one step behind, lurking in the shadows. I felt trapped, panic rising in my throat as I swerved through the dark, unfamiliar roads. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they following me? But I had no answers, just the overwhelming fear that I couldn't escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car was gone. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was nothing. No headlights, no sign of the vehicle at all. It was as if it had simply vanished into the night. I slowed down, cautiously scanning the road behind me, but the car had completely disappeared. My pulse was still racing, and my knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, unsure of what had just happened. I pulled over again, heart still pounding in my chest. I sat there for a long time, staring into the empty darkness, half expecting the car to reappear. But it didn't. The road was silent, the night still, and I was left with the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. It didn't make sense. Cars don't just vanish like that, but no matter how many times I replayed the events in my mind, I couldn't make sense of it. I eventually made it home, but the experience haunted me for days. I couldn't shake the image of those headlights, the way they had appeared out of nowhere, only to disappear just as quickly. It felt like a bad dream, but I knew it had been real. Every time I got behind the wheel after that, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, lurking in the distance, waiting to reappear. I never saw the car again, but the memory still lingers. Sometimes, late at night, when the road is dark and the highway stretches on endlessly, I think about that vanishing car and wonder, what would have happened if it hadn't disappeared? What did the driver want? And more terrifyingly, who or what was driving that car? It was a late, foggy night when I first saw him standing on the side of the road. The fog rolled in thick waves, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I was driving home from a long day at work, exhausted and eager to get home. But something about the way the man stood there, illuminated by my headlights, caught my attention. He looked stranded, with his thumb out and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I rolled down the window and asked if he needed a ride. His face was hidden in the shadows, but he nodded, grateful. He climbed into the passenger seat without saying much, just a brief, "Thanks for stopping." There was something about his voice that made me uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, he was probably just another traveler in need of a little help. For the first few miles, the silence between us was thick. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was headed. He mumbled something about a town a few miles down the road, but his eyes never left the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the tension growing in the car. I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, wondering if I had made a mistake picking him up. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. In my rearview mirror, I could see the outline of the man I had just picked up, but it wasn't just his reflection. There was something else, something behind him, barely visible through the fog. My heart skipped a beat as I realized there was no way anyone could be standing outside the car at that speed. Yet there it was, a shadowy figure in the mirror, standing on the side of the road at every stop. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the long day had gotten to me, and I was seeing things. But every time I checked the mirror, the figure was there, at every stoplight, every turn, standing motionless on the side of the road. My stomach twisted in knots, and I started to feel cold dread creeping in. Who was this man in my car? And why did I feel like I couldn't shake the presence of the shadow in the mirror? I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know someone who might be following us?" I asked, half joking but hoping for some kind of explanation. The man's head slowly turned toward me, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. His eyes were hollow, sunken in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't answer me. He just stared, his gaze cold and unnerving, as if he knew something I didn't. That was when I made the decision to drop him off at the next gas station, no matter how far it was. The unease was unbearable now, and the figure in the mirror seemed to be drawing closer. I could feel its presence, even though I knew it was impossible. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I sped up, desperate to get rid of this hitchhiker. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned to me and said, "You shouldn't have picked me up." My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't suppress the shiver that ran down my spine. His voice was flat, emotionless, like a warning. I didn't ask any more questions. I just drove faster, watching the fog swirl around the car as the figure in the mirror grew clearer, closer. The silence between us was suffocating now, and every second felt like a lifetime. I was counting the minutes until I could get rid of him. Finally, I spotted a dimly lit gas station in the distance. I pulled in, not caring if it was open or not. I needed him out of my car. As I slowed to a stop, the man turned to me with a chilling smile. "This is where I get off," he said softly, opening the door. But before he left, he leaned in closer, his breath cold against my skin. "I'll be seeing you," he whispered. He stepped out of the car, and I immediately locked the doors, my hands trembling. But before I could drive away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and there he was. The figure from the road, standing just behind the gas station, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I hit the gas, speeding out of the lot and onto the highway without looking back. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze. The image of the shadowy figure burned into my mind. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. I never saw the man again. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch glimpses of a figure standing on the side of the road. I don't stop anymore. I don't pick up hitchhikers. And every time I see that shadow in the corner of my eye, I wonder, was it all in my head? Or is he still out there, waiting for me? It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful drive home after a long day. The highway was mostly empty, the moonlight casting a soft glow on the dark road ahead of me. I had the radio on low, just enough to break the silence of the night. But as the miles ticked by, a strange sensation crept over me. It was subtle at first, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, out of habit more than anything. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately snapped my head around to check the back seat. Nothing. It was completely empty. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a reflection from outside. But when I looked back in the mirror, the figure was still there. Dark, indistinct, but undeniably present. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, as though it had always been there. I blinked hard, trying to shake the image from my mind. I must have been tired. Maybe it was just a shadow from the car's interior. But no matter how many times I looked back, the figure remained. My pulse quickened, and I felt my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, but the more I glanced at the mirror, the more convinced I became that something, or someone, was in the car with me. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the rising panic. But the shadow in the rearview seemed to grow darker, more defined. I could make out the outline of a head, hunched slightly forward, as if watching me. My breathing became shallow, and I resisted the urge to keep looking. I didn't want to see it anymore. I just wanted to get home, to the safety of my house, where I could lock the doors and be done with this nightmare. The miles stretched on, and every minute felt like an eternity. I fought the overwhelming urge to pull over, but fear kept me moving. What if stopping made things worse? What if whatever was in the back seat was waiting for me to stop? I kept driving, trying to keep my focus on the road ahead, but I could feel the weight of the shadow in the car with me. It was as if the temperature had dropped, a cold chill settling over the back of my neck. Then something even more terrifying happened. The figure in the mirror leaned forward. My heart stopped, my entire body freezing in place as I saw the shadow move for the first time. It was subtle, but there was no denying it now. Something was there, and it was no longer content to just sit in the back seat. My hands shook as I tried to stay calm, but panic was quickly taking over. I finally gave in and pulled over to the side of the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw the car in park and twisted around to check the back seat, fully expecting to see the figure looming behind me. But once again, it was empty. No shadow, no figure, just the stillness of the night. My heart was racing, and I felt foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fear, and took a deep breath. But when I turned back to face the road, the figure was now sitting in the passenger seat beside me. I screamed, my hands scrambling to unbuckle my seatbelt. The figure was closer now, its form still indistinct, but impossibly real. I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to get out of the car, but it wouldn't budge. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, its presence oppressive and suffocating. I could feel its gaze on me, though I couldn't see its eyes. Suddenly, a low whisper filled the car, so faint that I could barely make out the words. "You can't leave." The voice sent chills down my spine, and my entire body went cold. I yanked at the door again, and this time it flew open. I stumbled out of the car, gasping for air as I stood on the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back at the car, half expecting to see the shadowy figure sitting in the passenger seat. But the car was empty. I stood there for a long time, too scared to get back in the car, but knowing I had no choice. The road was deserted, and I was miles from home. Eventually, I gathered the courage to climb back into the driver's seat, my hands still trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror again. I couldn't. I didn't want to see if the figure had returned. When I finally made it home, I bolted inside, locking every door and window. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I hadn't been hallucinating. I knew that much. Something had been in the car with me, but what it was, I couldn't say. Even now, I avoid looking in the rearview mirror when I'm driving at night. I don't want to risk seeing that shadow again. And I still hear the whisper sometimes, faint and chilling, reminding me, "You can't leave." It was a quiet, late night, and I was driving down a stretch of empty road, the only sound coming from the steady hum of my car's engine. The road was dark and winding, with only the occasional streetlight casting a dim glow. I had driven this way many times before, but tonight felt different. There was something unsettling about the stillness, as if the night was holding its breath. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees along the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. They were just standing there, completely still, staring out into the distance. I slowed down, wondering if they needed help. But as I approached, the figure didn't move, didn't react to my car at all. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. I drove past, casting a quick glance at the figure as I passed. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but something about the way they stood, motionless and rigid, sent a chill down my spine. My heart started to race, and I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. There was no reason to be scared, I told myself. People walk along these roads all the time. But still, something about that figure didn't feel right. I shook off the feeling and continued driving, trying to focus on the road ahead. But after a few minutes, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat when I realized the figure was back, standing on the side of the road again, just as still as before. It was impossible. There was no way they could have gotten ahead of me so quickly. I hadn't passed any turnoffs, and the road had been empty. Yet, there they were, staring straight ahead as if waiting for me to pass again. A cold dread settled over me as I drove past for the second time, my mind racing with questions. Who was this person, and how had they managed to appear ahead of me again? My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed down harder on the gas, eager to put distance between myself and the eerie figure. I kept my eyes firmly on the road, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe there was another road that I hadn't noticed, and they had somehow gotten ahead of me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I drove for another few minutes, the road winding through the dark trees. My hands were slick with sweat, and every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the dim light of my headlights. Just as I started to relax, thinking I had left the figure behind, I saw them again. This time, they were standing even closer to the edge of the road, as if daring me to stop. A wave of fear washed over me. There was no way this was possible. No human could have gotten ahead of me 3 times, not without me seeing them. The figure hadn't moved, not once, and yet it felt as if they were somehow following me. I considered turning around, going back the way I came, but something told me that wouldn't help. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but the fear gnawing at me was undeniable. I didn't want to slow down or look at the figure again, but I couldn't help myself. As I passed them once more, I turned my head slightly, just enough to see them through the corner of my eye. This time, they were facing me. Their face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching as I drove by. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whoever, or whatever they were, they didn't seem human. The air in the car grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head. But the figure's presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. I drove faster, desperate to get away, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Something inside me screamed that if I did, I would see them, sitting in the back seat, waiting. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse racing. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on all sides. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a gas station up ahead. The flickering neon sign was a welcome sight, a small beacon of safety in the middle of the night. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The station was empty, but the lights were on, casting a dim glow over the lot. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself that I had finally escaped. But the feeling of dread didn't leave me. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Slowly, I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me through the rear window. But the back seat was empty. The relief was short-lived, though. As I glanced out the side window, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the parking lot, was the figure. They hadn't moved from their spot, still as ever, but now they were watching me again. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking as I jammed them back into the ignition. I didn't care how far I had to drive. I just needed to get away. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct told me that if I stopped, if I so much as glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure would be there, closer than ever. I drove for hours, refusing to slow down, even when exhaustion began to set in. The road eventually opened up, leading me back toward civilization, and the weight of fear began to lift. But the memory of the roadside figure clung to me, refusing to fade. I didn't know who or what they were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. Even now, when I drive down that stretch of road, I catch myself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see them again. It's been months since that night, but the image of the figure standing by the road still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the car, I feel a chill run down my spine, as though they're watching me again, waiting for me to return. And every time I pass by that same stretch of road, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had stopped? I had been on the road for hours, heading toward a remote destination for some much-needed peace and quiet. The sun had long since set, and I was grateful to have found a small roadside motel, one of those old, forgotten places that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign flickered faintly as I pulled into the gravel lot. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. I checked in, took the key from the bored-looking clerk, and made my way to the room. The air felt thick and heavy, but I brushed it off as road fatigue. The room was simple, a little rundown, but clean enough. I threw my bag onto the bed and collapsed onto the mattress, the exhaustion of the long drive finally catching up with me. I planned to shower and turn in early, eager to hit the road again in the morning. But as I lay there staring at the peeling wallpaper, an uneasy feeling crept over me. It was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unsettling, suffocating kind. I shook off the feeling and decided to shower, hoping the hot water would help me relax. The bathroom was small, the mirror fogging up almost instantly as I stepped into the lukewarm spray. But even as the water ran, I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that something was off. I kept glancing at the shower curtain, half expecting to see something or someone standing on the other side. It was just nerves, I told myself. Nothing more. After the shower, I got into bed, flipping through the channels on the old TV in an attempt to distract myself. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at me, making the air in the room feel thick and heavy. I eventually turned the TV off, pulled the covers up, and tried to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my door. At first, I thought it might be another guest returning to their room. But as the footsteps grew closer, they didn't stop. They moved up and down the hallway, the pace unnervingly slow, as if whoever was walking wasn't in any hurry. My heart started to race as I listened to the steps go back and forth, each one echoing louder in the stillness of the night. I sat up in bed, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for the steps to fade. But they didn't. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was nearly 2 a.m. Who could possibly be walking around at this hour? I thought about calling the front desk, but something stopped me. I was embarrassed. It was probably just someone restless, unable to sleep, just like me. I lay back down, determined to ignore it, but the footsteps only got louder, more deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but the silence was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. For a long moment I thought maybe it was over, maybe whoever it was had finally moved on. But then the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, fear gripping me as the knob turned slowly. The door was locked, but that didn't stop the person on the other side from trying to open it. My mind raced, wondering if I should call for help or stay silent. The rattling continued for what felt like an eternity, but then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The footsteps returned, this time moving slowly down the hallway, away from my door. I got out of bed, my hands trembling as I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I debated whether to open the door or just wait until morning, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly unlocked the door and cracked it open, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, but the faint sound of footsteps still echoed in the distance. I shut the door quickly, locking it again and backing away. My heart was racing, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep for the rest of the night. I paced the room, my mind racing with possibilities. Who had been out there? Why had they tried to get into my room? The footsteps hadn't sounded hurried or frantic. They had been slow, almost purposeful. It was as if they knew exactly what they were doing. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sign of the footsteps returning. But they didn't. Morning finally came, and I packed my things as quickly as I could, eager to leave the strange motel behind. As I checked out, I asked the clerk if anyone else had complained about noise during the night. She gave me a puzzled look and said I was the only guest staying there. I left without saying another word, my skin crawling at the thought of being the only one in the motel. The memory of those footsteps still haunts me. Even now, whenever I stay in a hotel or motel, I find myself listening for that slow, deliberate sound in the hallway, dreading the moment when the footsteps stop right outside my door again. It was late, past midnight, when I found myself driving on a rural road, miles away from any signs of civilization. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but instead of turning back, I decided to follow the road and see where it led. The night was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. My headlights illuminated the narrow, winding road ahead, but the surrounding darkness pressed in on all sides. The road soon led me to an old, rickety bridge spanning a river below. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for one car at a time, with rusted railings that looked as though they could crumble at any moment. I hesitated for a second, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but there was no other option. The road on the other side of the bridge was my only way forward. I took a deep breath and began to cross. As my tires rolled onto the wooden planks of the bridge, they creaked under the weight of the car, each sound echoing in the stillness of the night. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying not to think about how far the drop might be if the bridge gave way. About halfway across, a pair of headlights appeared on the other side, speeding toward me. The road had been empty for miles, and suddenly there was a car coming directly at me, as if it had materialized out of the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way both of us could fit on the bridge at the same time. I slowed down, waiting for the other driver to do the same, but they didn't. The car kept speeding toward me, its headlights blinding, growing brighter with every second. Panic set in as I realized they weren't slowing down. They were coming straight at me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. The other vehicle was nearly upon me now, its headlights filling my windshield. I braced for impact, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but at the last second, the car swerved. It missed me by inches, its tires barely grazing the side of the bridge as it careened past. My heart was racing, adrenaline surging through my veins. But when I turned to look in my rearview mirror, the car was gone. It hadn't passed me. It had simply vanished. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the darkness behind me. There was no sign of the car, no taillights fading into the distance, nothing. Just the empty road and the oppressive silence of the night. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The car had been real. I had seen it, felt the rush of wind as it passed, but now it was as though it had never been there at all. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right about this place. I pressed the gas and continued across the bridge, eager to get off it as quickly as possible. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of trick of the light? But deep down, I knew what I had seen. That car had come straight at me, and now it was gone. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, as I reached the other side of the bridge and sped away. For a while, I thought I had left the encounter behind me, but as I drove further down the road, I noticed something strange. A flicker of light appeared in my rearview mirror. Headlights. The same blinding headlights I had seen on the bridge. My heart skipped a beat as the lights grew brighter, closer, until they were right behind me. I pressed the gas pedal harder, speeding up, but the car stayed right on my tail, its headlights burning into my mirrors. I swerved, trying to outrun the vehicle, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed behind me, impossibly close. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't shake it. I was trapped on this dark, empty road with no way out. My mind raced with fear. What was happening? Who or what was behind the wheel of that car? Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car vanished again. One moment, its headlights were blinding me, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I slowed down, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The road was empty once more, but the dread lingered, a cold weight settling in my chest. I drove for what felt like hours, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, half expecting the car to reappear at any moment, but it didn't. The night stretched on in an eerie, unsettling silence. When I finally saw the faint glow of a town up ahead, relief washed over me. I pulled into the nearest gas station and parked, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the memory of that car, the way it had vanished into thin air. Later, I learned that I wasn't the first person to encounter the ghostly vehicle. Locals told me that the bridge had been the site of a deadly accident years ago, when a car had swerved off the side, plunging into the river below. Ever since, drivers had reported seeing the same headlights speeding toward them, only for the car to disappear without a trace. I had crossed paths with something not of this world that night. Even now, I avoid that bridge, choosing longer routes just to stay away. The memory of that encounter still haunts me, and every time I drive at night, I glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those blinding headlights chasing me once again. It was supposed to be an exciting cross-country road trip, the kind where I could clear my mind and enjoy the open road. Everything was going smoothly until I noticed the car. It was a nondescript, older model, nothing about it that stood out, except for the fact that it had been behind me for miles. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, long stretches of highway can make it feel like the same cars are trailing you for ages. But this one stayed with me, always at the same distance, never passing, never falling behind. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, wondering why they didn't just go around. The road was mostly empty, and there had been plenty of opportunities for them to pass. The longer the car stayed behind me, the more unsettled I became. I thought about slowing down to let them pass, but something about the way they kept their distance, just close enough to be noticeable, yet far enough that I couldn't make out the driver, made me hesitate. After another 20 minutes of this strange pursuit, I took the next exit, hoping to lose them. The exit led to a small rest stop, a quiet place where I could stretch my legs and shake off the paranoia building in my mind. But as I pulled into the parking lot, my heart sank. The car followed me. They pulled in behind me, parking just far enough away to keep their distance, yet close enough that I could feel their presence. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe they were just another traveler, stopping to rest just like I was. But when I got out of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. The car remained parked, the windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see who was inside. The driver didn't get out, didn't make a move, just sat there, waiting. I decided to leave the rest stop, hoping to outrun the growing sense of dread. As soon as I got back on the highway, I pushed the speed limit, trying to put as much distance between myself and that car as possible. For a while, I thought I had succeeded. The road stretched out before me, empty and quiet, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But just as I was starting to relax, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was. The same car, following me again. A cold chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Whoever was in that car was deliberately following me, and they weren't going to stop. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they just trying to scare me? Were they waiting for the right moment to make their move? I had no answers, only the growing terror that I couldn't shake them. I sped up, my heart pounding in my chest, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed with me, always at the same distance. It was as if they were toying with me, keeping me in sight, but never getting close enough to confront me. The sky grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, and soon the only light came from my headlights and the car's glowing eyes in my rearview mirror. I decided to take another exit, this time turning onto a back road that wound through a dense forest. My hope was that the narrow, twisting road would throw them off, but as I glanced back, the car followed me, its headlights cutting through the trees. Panic set in. I was completely alone, miles away from any town or gas station, and whoever was following me clearly had no intention of leaving. I floored the gas pedal, the road becoming a blur as I sped through the dark forest. The car kept pace, its headlights never wavering. My pulse raced as I took sharp turns, hoping the other driver would lose control or give up. But no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me, an ever-present shadow that refused to let me go. Finally, I spotted a small clearing up ahead. I pulled into it, throwing the car into park and jumping out, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I scanned the road, expecting to see the car pull in behind me. But when I looked, the road was empty. The headlights were gone. It was as if the car had vanished into thin air. I stood there, heart pounding, staring into the darkness, half expecting it to reappear at any moment. For a long time, I stayed in that clearing, waiting for the car to come back, but it never did. The night was silent, the forest still, but the fear lingered. I eventually got back in the car and continued driving, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but the memory of that silent pursuer stayed with me, haunting me at every turn. To this day, I don't know who was following me or what they wanted. But every time I get on a highway, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, watching for those headlights. The worst part is, I know that if I ever see that car again, they won't be so easy to escape.